Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Joseph Attic, Executive Chairman of ID4Africa, and this is Livecast number 44. I'd like to welcome you all to the final chapter of our Augmented General Meeting for 2023. Today's episode will consist of two major segments, where we will hear the reports from workshops 1 and 3 that took place physically in Nairobi about a month ago. Let me remind you that Workshop 1 was about building the DPIs and was chaired by the World Bank, while Workshop 3 was about creating an African shared eCRVS asset, the so-called ACSA initiative, and was co-chaired by UNICEF and OpenCRVS. With this final chapter, all sessions of the AGM this year are available as digital public goods for replay on our YouTube channel. There is a wealth of information that you can explore on that channel. While at it, please subscribe, like, and share. In addition to the AGM videos, all plenary presentations are now available for download from our Knowledge Hub. The link is available in the chat. As this year's highly successful AGM comes to a close, we can reflect on the many of its lessons, not just the rich content that it embodied, but also its operational dynamic. The best way to describe an ID4Africa AGM is as an ecosystem with abundant supply of and demand for knowledge related to a thematic topic. The emergence of such a rich ecosystem is no accident. It's the product of curation of responsive content and selection of the right delegations from the hundreds of stakeholder institutions from Africa and the world. But ultimately, the AGM owes its success to its attendees who come with passion and enthusiasm, armed with knowledge they generously share, which is exactly what happened in Nairobi. This year's AGM was a clear demonstration of the importance of the community around which an event is built. At ID4Africa, we have focused on nurturing this community and on giving it voice over the years. Today, once more, we pay homage to this community and its brain trust, and we pledge to build on this collective success all the way to the next AGM. Work has already started for 2024. I encourage you to reach out to me at any time if you have any suggestions for topics and content you think the next AGM should embody. Before we begin today's episode, I would like to thank the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for their support of this livecast. I also want to remind you that we are less than 3 months away from 16 September, and you know what that means. Identity Day is rapidly approaching. This year, in view of how important digital identity has become, we need to raise the bar on building awareness around this issue worldwide. As we have argued often in the past, identity is our most valuable asset. Yet, on the list of UN-recognized days, there is no commemorative day to celebrate this cornerstone of our existence. If you think like we do, that it is time to rectify this oversight on a global scale, we invite you to join the action now. To start with, more countries need to embrace Identity Day on a national level as we wait for consensus to build internationally. By doing so, these countries reaffirm their commitment to providing everyone with proper identification, empowering them to exercise their rights, access vital services, and participate fully in social, economic, and political spheres. This is a noble cause worth fighting for, but that is only one aspect of this commemorative day, which we believe should not be limited to the development agenda. Identity Day should also be a reminder to everyone, including those who possess proper identification, to demand that their data and their privacy are protected, and that their credentials are empowering them in their daily lives. Identity Day, just like identity, is for all. I like to imagine the day when nations around the world come together on 16 September to routinely celebrate human identity, share hope about its future, and renew their commitment to empowering people responsibly through identity. A day where no one is invisible and where everyone's voice is heard and where no individual is marginalized due to lack of identity. This is the Identity Day towards which we drive. We can imagine it, so let us work towards getting there. But this will require action. It's not enough to celebrate. So I appeal to all governments, to officially recognize 16 September as Identity Day by issuing national decrees or executive orders. Of course, this should be more than just a symbolic gesture. It is an unambiguous recognition of the significance of identity in a country's transformation agenda. I also urge the coalition partners, the friends of the coalition, civil society actors, and everyone else in our community to continue sensitizing the public and to start planning to commemorate the day this year, even if it is not officially yet recognized in your country. With this call for action, we kick off the ID Day campaign for 2023, which together we will enrich all the way to 16 September. I'd like to salute the pioneers, Nigeria, Namibia, and Niger, for having recognized 16 September officially. I invite other governments around the world to join them this year by declaring the day. Talk to us if you need help planning your campaign. Finally, I want to draw your attention once again to the ongoing call for input on generative AI for development. As I said in the prior livecast, AI has the potential to revolutionize development practices by giving a boost to countries that lack capacity. But it would need to be carefully managed to ensure that the negative side of AI and its risks are well mitigated, so that this breakthrough technology can be harnessed for good only. If you have something interesting to say about this, please submit a proposal to speak. Now, we are ready to begin our episode. With us today, in order of appearance, are Julia Clark, Senior Economist, the World Bank, Marie Einholzer, Digital Development Specialist, World Bank, Mustafa Mahmoud, Co-Director, Namati, Esther Ode Uru, Social Development Specialist, Wuri, Benin, Bethlehem Mergia, Planning and Monitoring and Evaluation Director, National ID Program, Ethiopia, Matthew McNaughton, Head, Civil Society Engagement, Co-Develop, Dr. Pramod Varma, Co-Chair, Center for DPI, Aime Mukunma, E-Government Advisor, Digital Government Agency, DR Congo, Fiumeng Liu, Chief, Digital Center for Excellence, UNICEF, Bhaskar Mishra, CRVS and Legal Identity Specialist, UNICEF, Edward Duffes, Director, Product Strategy and Sustainability, OpenCRVS, William Muwava, Chief Demographic and Social Statistics Section, UNECA, Cornelius Williams, former Director for Child Protection at UNICEF, Rosemary Kisimbo, Executive Director, NIRA, Uganda, Togbe Agbagla, Technical Director, Togo Digital Agency, Jinabu Toure Kamara, Civil Registry Reform and Modernization Coordinator, Ministry of Territorial Administration and Decentralization, Guinea, and Tulemeki Munyeka, Director, NPRIP, Ministry of Home Affairs, Immigration, Safety and Security, Namibia. Thank you to all the panelists for taking the time to join us for this episode. We're going to start segment one, which is the report from the World Bank. I'd like to thank the World Bank team, especially Julia and Marie, for chairing this important workshop and for being with us to chair this segment today. Let me give the stage to Julia to kick off the segment. Julia, welcome again. The stage is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Joseph, for having us. As always, this is a great platform. We held a wonderful workshop last month that was lively and productive, and we're very happy to be here today to share some of the lessons and takeaways and to hear from some of our speakers as well as some of the contributors who are in the room. So just to give you an overview of where we're going in this first 90 minutes. So we're going to talk about building DPI that meets the needs of people, then a session on meeting the needs of service providers, and then ending with how to overcome the challenge of convening and mobilizing diverse actors. And we have a number of great speakers today. I won't go through all the names as Joseph just introduced them, but I also wanted to acknowledge and thank the 3 additional discussants that we had last month that aren't joining us today. So Yanis Theodoru, Tavit and Fanny Sathoga from South Africa, Indonesia, and Tony Blair Institute in reverse order. So thank you to all of them. And just before we launch today, I wanted to give us just a shared definition, at least for the purpose of this presentation, of how we think about digital public infrastructure, just so we're all sort of at least on the same page for today's 90 minutes. So we think of this as the roads and the railways of the digital age. So specifically, platforms that enable society-wide functions and services across the public and private sector. So generally speaking, identity, payments, data exchange, and other trust services. So just to give you a brief intro of why we're here today, why we wanted to convene this session in partnership with ID4Africa, we started off as a motivating example with a brief story of a fictional country named Digital Numerica that had a brand new president who convened a council of advisors to come up with a plan on how to accelerate digital economy and inclusivity in this country. They came up with, surprise, surprise, based on our audience and topic, the idea of a new digital ID system to accelerate digital transactions and growth. The president loved this idea, and she provided them with legal foundations and all of the funding that they needed to build this system. They hired the best engineers, and they built a state-of-the-art system and successfully piloted it with civil servants in the capital region. After this, the president was very excited. She issued a decree saying that they would enroll millions of people within the next few years. And they set up registration locations all across the country. After registration started, then she was focusing on use cases. So with her advisors, the president decided that the first 3 primary use cases for the ID should be on increasing tax collection, reducing fraud and ghosts in the public sector, and on SIM registration. So then the agency diligently sent information to each of these ministries and provided online training so that they could easily onboard to the digital ID services. So then we fast forwarded 5 years to take a look at how implementation was going. Technically, this seems like a great project, and they have political support, and they have resources, and they have identified these impactful use cases at the national level. Unfortunately, what we saw is that registration was very low, particularly in rural areas. And there was a lot of public concern and protest over the system and the lack of transparency around it. Service providers, only one of them, the tax authority, was able to actually integrate, but this increased public concern and suspicion about the project that it was only meant to increase their tax rates and tax take. So the project had a lot of negative publicity, and the president eventually distanced herself, and this project sadly died. So then we asked ourselves, well, what went wrong, given that there were technically sound systems, there was all the political will and all the resources behind it, and the president answers that really it was about centering people and service providers, and that if there had been better involvement all along of multiple stakeholders to develop the system, to select the use cases, to design how it would be used, then it might have been much more successful. So that's the thesis of our workshop and why we wanted to essentially convene all of you as practitioners and policymakers to think through how we can really meet this secret ingredient, which shouldn't be secret, about the success of ID systems. And so this first ingredient, this first piece of this recipe is really on meeting the needs of the people themselves. So why does this matter? Why do we need to think about engagement of individuals? And it's because it provides essential input at all stages of an ID system project. So one is that it provides us with answers on what's working or not working on the current system so that we can plan improvements. It gives us an understanding of different users across society who have different needs, and skills and preferences and concerns to make sure that all of those are being addressed and listened to and accounted for. Helpfully, it can really help identify people for whom digital technologies or a particular ID system may actually exacerbate the problems that they face rather than fixing them, so that we can make adjustments or allowances in these cases. It also gives us a broad sense of the readiness of different contexts for purely end-to-end digital transaction or more, hybrid digital physical services, and what's most appropriate for a given country. And then finally, it can help provide feedback to solve problems and meet demands throughout implementation. So this shouldn't be just a one-time input, but really can be part of ongoing monitoring and learning and iteration and adaptation over time. So the goal of part of the workshop and a lot of the work that we do at the World Bank Identification for Development Initiative is to help provide countries with tools and resources to do just this. And so there are a number of different tools that countries can look to engage people, citizens, the public, and CSOs throughout the project. So again, this is figuring out who needs to be engaged, whether it's marginalized groups, power users on specific aspects, which CSOs should be involved in discussions, conducting research, so doing qualitative studies as well as quantitative work and surveys, various assessments. These are also essential, and again, involving people in these assessments themselves on inclusion and rights, data protection, and people's digital skills and preferences and more. And then finally, involving people around prototyping and piloting new ID systems, on monitoring and evaluation, and on grievance redress mechanisms. So if you go to our website, we have materials that touch on a number of these issues and some upcoming materials that I'll share. But for now, this is sort of an example of creating personas and user journeys as part of a new use case toolkit that we're developing. So that's sort of an overall sense of where we went with this session. And we have three key takeaways from the presentations and the discussion and the feedback. So one is that identifying and involving local communities and their representative groups needs to be an active and, well, really a proactive process, not just an afterthought, and that these engagements have to be actually genuine. And so in order for some people to participate, this may require active mobilization, funding travel. We heard a great example around that from South Africa. And that what really matters about inclusivity is not just words, it's the actions that the system is taking, both in involving people in the process and then the resulting design. Another piece of advice based on a number of countries was on beginning engagement early. So not waiting until a system is designed and a press release is issued that enrollment will begin to actually involve people. Involving them early during planning, during legislation, and making sure that that feedback isn't one time, as I said before, that it's continuous and that it represents people from diverse backgrounds and needs. And a third important lesson, and one of the discussants put it as, you wouldn't ask a developer to do open heart surgery, but essentially this idea that there are specialists and people, both people that could be hired as part of ID agencies and projects, but also people working in CSOs and other partners who are experts on public engagement. And those skills may be very different from the skills of the rest of the ID agency or other ministries. And so really engaging them can help provide this essential skill set for engagement. And I wanted to leave you with a quote from Fanny, who again couldn't join us, but his perspective from South Africa was quite helpful in highlighting that they see themselves as a citizen-facing entity, and so they should be shaking hands with citizens on every aspect of what they do. So that's an overall lesson. I wanted to give the chance to two of our other participants to share some of their insights. So first we have Mustafa Mahmoud from Namati, and then Esther from the Worry Project. So first, Mustafa, over to you, if you can put your camera on. So this is a screenshot from a video that you showed of a woman named Habiba. And we were wondering if you could just tell for the people online a little bit more about Habiba and what were the key challenges in her journey of identification.
Thank you so much, Mary. My name is Mustafa. The picture that you're seeing is of Habiba. Habiba is a resident of Kibera slums, or as the Nubian community called it, Kibra. And she started applying for an ID at the age of 18. So in Kenya, when you turn the age of 18, you are supposed to walk into any registration office for identity documentation from Monday to Friday. So like any regular person, she went there and she was told only Tuesdays and Thursdays is when Nubian community are supposed to apply. So she went on a Tuesday, she found the Nubian elders who were supposed to identify her by knowing whether they know their her grandfather, grandmother, her mother, her father. After that, they enrolled her. So that's the first screening. Then after that, they were supposed to enroll her for a list of a second screening, which you call vetting. So this vetting is whereby you appear in front of a panel of security individuals who screen you and ask you questions that range from what food you eat, if you ever crossed the border, and the likes. So she went through the whole process. Unfortunately, she failed the vetting 5 times. And every time she applies, and she's told, you look more Ethiopian because of the color of your skin. And she gave up in the process. In 2014, she got her first child, and it became now, because she had given up the process, it became now a requirement because she needed her ID to register the birth of her children. It became more complicated because the husband died without even having an ID card. So it meant that these children's fate lied on her hands, and by all means, she needed to get that document. Remember, you're supposed to apply at the age of 18. By the time she was going back now, she had already become like 23. And at the age of 23, now you are supposed to go for an additional screening that is called District Security and Intelligence Committee. That committee has all the security organs that are supposed to be discussing issues of security in the area. And they will call you at any given particular time because they expect you without an ID should be in the house sleeping. So she went through that vetting several times and still they denied her the document. She got help around 2019 from a paralegal at Nubia Rights Forum, one of our paralegal partners that empower communities on their rights, on the process, and also work the process with the community members. It took the intervention of a paralegal, but at the same time, it took additional 4 years for her to get an ID card. 20 years later, on the 14th of February 2023, she got her ID card. But after 20 years, what has she lost? It meant that during COVID hit, she could not get vaccine. She could not register a SIM card. She could not move freely, and all her kids did not have a birth certificate. So this is the story of Habiba, who's a case study of 1 in 5 million people who go through this process that we call vetting, which is a discriminatory process that someone has to go based on their ethnicity or religion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. I think that illustrates sort of a number of the issues that we see, and is, you know, the kind of arduous journey that when we hear it is astounding, but is more commonplace, I think, than people realize. And so was wondering if you could just highlight very quickly before we move on to Esther, specifically what the main challenges are, just so we have them in, you know, a bullet pointed list in the communities that you work with in Kenya, but more broadly, that people face in obtaining an identification and any solutions to tackle them in just a couple of minutes.
So one of the challenges that we have in terms of obtaining documentation is we have a set of ethnic groups that are considered Kenyans by a list that is non-existent. We always talk about 42 ethnic districts, and all these are colonial districts that were developed. But Kenya has a lot of communities, and we're almost at 100, but unfortunately the remaining for 58 are minority communities that are clustered under others. So these others have to prove where they came from. They have to go through a panel to prove their belonging. It's illegal for these communities to eat a particular food, to not possess English names because most of them are Muslim, and because of securitization of the nationality, these communities have undergone scrutiny by scrutiny, and this has been exacerbated by the fact that the law gives the registrar of persons excessive discretion, to the extent that the registrar of persons can ask you for a land title deed, to ask you for what food you eat, even take your phone and see if you've ever called Somalia or another country. So it is legitimizing things that are legal, but it's making it illegal for particular communities. And the biggest problem is that these are minority communities who lack representation and the like. So the biggest challenge that we have is the fact that the registrar has excessive discretion, and it's not regularized in law. And even the vetting itself is also not regularized in law. And the fact that the whole process is not even part of the application, it's a problem by itself, because it's a pre-application process for you to be able to apply. So in general, all this is basically discrimination based on your religion or even the color of your skin, like Habiba being told that your color is more Ethiopian, and yet other ethnic communities are allowed to be light-skinned, but for her, she's not allowed.
And in one sentence, what would you say is the recommendation for how engaging with citizens, with communities like Habiba can be helpful in overcoming these issues?
The first thing of engaging with citizens, you'll know where the pitfall is. I like the way you introduced it, and you said that digital public infrastructure is like a railway, or it's like a road. But you'll find that people like Habiba, even if you build a railway and you have a train there, they cannot access it. So you will get to know where the people are dropping off from, or if they're not even able to board, so that you can be able to develop systems that are inclusive. Because when you have these people who are being, this is not even a crack, it's a big fault, or we can even call it a valley that people are falling into. By interacting with the community, you can know the real problem on the ground and be able to tailor-made solutions that can be able to enroll them. So it could be like simple as addressing already existing systemic discrimination that these people have been left out, so that they feel like they're part of a bigger nation and a bigger process, and their voices have been heard.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mustafa. So I think now we'll move quickly on to Esther. If you can join us via camera. Esther, s'il vous plaît. So the...
Oui.
Oui. Bonjour. Merci beaucoup. So you are one of the contributors to the discussions that followed Mustafa's presentation in our workshop last May. And your work is as a social development specialist for the WORI project. So I was wondering if you can tell us a bit more about the WORI project and how you're addressing inclusion specifically for the needs of the most vulnerable people.
Merci beaucoup, Claire. Et bonjour à tous. C'est un plaisir pour moi de prendre la parole et de partager un peu l'expérience du projet WORI Bénin. C'est un projet de la Banque mondiale qui œuvre dans le domaine de l'identification des personnes. Et la question de l'inclusion est centrale dans la mise en œuvre du projet. Donc, très tôt, nous avons essayé d'avoir des rencontres, des discussions avec nos populations pour leur montrer l'avantage d'être identifiés et de posséder un certificat d'identification qu'est le FID de la Banque mondiale. Et nous avons pu attirer l'attention de nos populations grâce aux avantages de ce certificat qui est obtenu gratuitement et qui a une durée de validité indéterminée. Ceci a été un élément motivateur pour la population et surtout pour la population vulnérable.
Esther, one moment. Yes, Diane, go ahead.
Oui, si vous voulez bien, Esther, je vais devoir interpréter à l'écran en anglais, donc faire des phrases très courtes et me laisser interpréter chaque phrase, ça va m'aider. Je vais essayer de dire un peu ce que vous venez de dire en anglais, mais ça pourrait m'aider pour la suite parce que ça me permettrait d'être plus exact. Okay, I'm going to try to interpret what she has said. I have just asked her to just make sure the sentences so I can convey better what she is trying to say. So she thank you, Claire, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about the World Bank and how it has helped us in our program for identification of people. It did, in fact, have a central role in inclusion. It was a big step in meeting with people and talking with the population, and it's a project that allowed us to provide certifications and a registration that is called the FID, that is World Bank identification system and program and number that is attributed, and it has attracted the attention from the population, and we have as well explained to the population all its advantage. It is free and it doesn't have an expiry date. So it has been a great motivator for the population. Okay.
Okay. Merci beaucoup. Et je voudrais aussi ajouter que nous avons fait encadrer par des lois le certificat FID afin de prouver à la population que c'est une pièce qui est reconnue et qui peut leur donner droit à des avantages, à des services pour faciliter l'accès à ces services. Donc, nous avons encadré la possession de ce certificat par des tests de loi, ce qui fait que c'est une pièce qui est vraiment crédible et aujourd'hui, plus de la moitié de la population au Bénin possède déjà ce certificat qui va faciliter l'accès aux services sociaux de base, surtout pour la couche vulnérable.
So we also, on top of creating this FID certificate, we have framed it with laws, and we have shown that it is recognized and it can provide several advantages to the populations, like service access, especially to the grassroots population. And we have made it through the law a very credible, believable and trusted service, and most of people in Benin right now do have access, do have this identification, this certification, and have access to it.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup. So you mentioned in the meeting that accessing certain communities like the one in the picture can be more challenging. So can you tell us more about this village and the community-driven engagement that you used to reach these people?
Merci beaucoup, Clark, pour la question. Effectivement, nous avons des défis à relever par rapport à l'atteinte des populations. Et la solution que nous avons utilisée, c'est de réaliser une étude. Et une étude qui est basée sur l'évaluation environnementale, l'intégration sociale et le genre. Et cette étude nous a permis de faire la cartographie de chaque commune au Bénin. Donc, pour les 77 communes, nous avons réalisé des cartes et nous savons exactement les zones qui sont difficiles d'accès. Dans cette image, c'est dans le nord du Bénin, précisément dans la Takora, où il y a des habitants d'environ 300 personnes qui sont dans cette localité. Donc, nous savons déjà où sont positionnées les personnes à travers la carte, quelles sont les difficultés qu'on peut avoir pour accéder à cette population lors des opérations. Donc, nous essayons déjà de voir à l'avance quels moyens va nous permettre d'aller les atteindre lorsque nous avons des actions. Et nous avons aussi sur les cartes...
Un instant.
Okay. Merci.
So thank you for the question. We do have spotted some challenges that we do have to overcome, and especially regarding population expectations. We did a study to find out those challenges and try to come up with solutions. We did evaluations regarding the environment, social interactions, and we came up with a map of 77 towns and that are difficult to access, and this has allowed us to find out solutions for a better access. This photo, for example, it's a place in the north of Benin. It's in Ekapora. It's a town of 300 people, and to be able to locate these people and identify them have helped us to better provide access to these populations and to find ways to better reach them.
Okay. Et le deuxième élément que la cartographie nous a permis d'avoir, c'est les zones frontalières au Bénin. Donc, nous savons quelles sont les communes qui sont des communes qui ont une frontière, qui sont frontalières à un pays. Donc, ce qui nous permet de prendre les dispositifs idoines lors de nos opérations, parce que souvent, c'est des communes où on peut facilement faire des poches d'exclusion lors des opérations à cause de l'influence et de la frontière. Et le troisième élément, la carte
Un instant.
Okay.
The second element that this mapping has allowed us to do is that it has identified bordered areas and towns that were very next to some countries which have created some difficulties, and it has allowed us to establish some special bordered policies to avoid something that is easy to do, which is exclusion due to this border location.
Merci. Et le troisième élément de la cartographie nous permet de savoir, de connaître les zones où il y a de l'insécurité. Donc, nous savons quelles dispositions prendre lorsque nous avons des opérations dans cette zone et à quelle heure il faut-il quitter les lieux pour qu'on ne puisse pas vraiment être en danger par rapport à la zone. Donc, la cartographie nous permet vraiment d'aller là où les autres ne sont pas allés pour pouvoir faire les opérations grâce à l'appui de notre agence d'identification nationale. Donc, c'est cet élément-là qui va nous permettre de relever les défis par rapport à l'inclusion pour qu'il n'y ait pas de poche d'exclusion, parce que notre défi est clair au projet Ouri Bénin. Tout le monde doit être identifié et tout le monde doit avoir la facilité d'accéder aux services sociaux de base pour le développement. Merci beaucoup, c'est ce que je peux dire par rapport à cette question. Merci.
And the third element is that these mapping have allowed us to identify insecurity zones that weren't safe, and to map out the exact zones and also the time at which it was safer for us to go there and what time we had to leave the zones. So this has allowed us to enter these zones in a much better way. And this is a work that has done with the National Identification Agency, and it has helped us to overcome inclusion. And inclusion is definitely one of our main focus, to be able to identify bag of exclusions and resolve them, to make sure that everybody will have an ID and everybody will have access to basic social services. And this is what I wanted to convey here today.
Merci beaucoup, Esther.
Merci.
This was, I think, a great story, and one where this sort of holistic study and mapping that you did with communities really forms a foundation for the entire sort of inclusion plan. So very wonderful. So I think now we're at the end of the part one on users. Merci beaucoup, Esther. So I will now hand over to my colleague Marie to talk through how we can work with service providers to better meet their needs with digital public infrastructure. Over to you, Marie.
Thank you so much, Julia. So yes, now we will discuss how to meet the needs of the public and the private service providers in order to build a digital public infrastructure that is fit for purpose. So ahead of the workshop, we actually asked the contributors of ID4Africa what were the sectors that they had the strongest linkages with. And they replied that they had contact with the healthcare provider, public administration, and social protection. And that on the contrary, they were seeking to engage more with, again, social protection. So there was more to be done in this domain, but also bank and telecom sector. So this shows that it's more difficult usually to engage with the private sector for the government. So let's see now what could be done to better understand the needs of the services. And what we concluded during the workshop is that there is a need for an early analysis of the needs of the public and the private sectors that will use the digital public infrastructure of the country. So in terms of the different aspects that can be looked at, the first one is actually understanding what are the ID verification challenges of the sector. What are the current procedures? What are the information collected? What are the regulatory obligations? The second aspect is to actually understand the context of how those public and private services operate on the ground. Do they have internet access? Are the people digitally literate to use online services, for example? The third aspect is to actually understand what are the requirements of the service providers vis-a-vis the digital public infrastructure. So what would be the level of assurance that they are looking at? What would be the service level agreement that they would require from the digital public infrastructure to operate correctly their services? And finally, you also have to convince them that there is a cost-benefit ratio in their favor to invest in connecting to this digital public infrastructure. So again, they would be interested to know what is the level of adoption of, for example, an ID system. So is it worth it connected to it, or should they keep their specific solution that they had developed? So all of this is very important. And we also discussed how to put ourselves in the shoes of the service providers as an ID institution or DPI-led agency of the government, because we discussed that, of course, the role, if we take the example of ID, for the ID institution is to develop actually an ID system with different functions. But it's important to highlight how the service providers will be able to benefit from this function. So we took, for example, we just heard about Esther. The Benin ID has no a QR code that allows for the verification of the authenticity of the credential. And this is a great function, but it's important for the service providers to understand what they will be able to do with it. And one of the main aspects of that is, for example, to increase the protection of people against identity theft, or also reduce the potential for fraud that would actually reduce the amount of benefit that could reach the most in need. When we discussed about authentication functions of individuals, service provider would be interested to know that they would be able to remove duplicates from their records and ensure a uniqueness of the individuals in the system. And also the fact that data can be transferred from the ID system, a list of minimum data set of the personal information about people, allows for example, the service providers to offer better quality data and reduce the time needed at the point of service to, for example, onboard people for services. So all of these functions combined results in the possibility of offering better services, but it's really important to communicate this clearly to the service providers so they understand the benefits of this investment. And again, we, as part of the toolkit that we are developing, we will provide you with a list of questions that you can ask service providers to understand the context, their requirements, and also a methodology on how to prioritize use cases so that it's possible to focus on the use cases that will demonstrate early value for the ID system. Because during the workshop, we mentioned the importance of having demonstrating use cases that will show the benefits of investing in this type of digital public infrastructure. And for the key insights from the workshop, there were three. The first one was about simplifying the onboarding process by providing ready-to-use building blocks that would facilitate the adoption by service providers to reduce really the cost of connecting to the system. But we also mentioned the fact that to maintain the simplicity and inclusivity of the foundational ID system, it's important that sector-specific solutions are still developed to cater for the sector-specific needs, building on this foundational ID. And the third aspect was the importance of prioritizing data and information system security, because this is critical for the private sector if they rely on external services to deliver the services, and also understanding their service business model and processes. So these were the key insights, and I'm now calling on Bethlehem from the Ethiopian National ID Project and Matthew from CoDevelop to join for a discussion to discuss and summarize what we had mentioned during the workshop. So I don't know, Betty, if you are connected with your camera and sound. So first of all, so we see on the screen a picture of a bank in Ethiopia. And Bethlehem, during your presentation, you talked about the challenges that you actually encountered when engaging with service providers like this bank. You provided examples that were really interesting, highlighting the fact that a state-of-the-art ID system is actually not sufficient to ensure the adoption by service providers and therefore deliver impactful use cases that would benefit people. And one of the challenges that you mentioned was related to the issue concerning the IT infrastructure of the service providers and the fact that many of them were actually lacking systems to integrate, but that they were also facing vendor locking issues and also limited digital skills to integrate with the ID system. So it would be interesting for the audience to know about how the National ID program is currently addressing these challenges, and how can you, as an organization, support the digital transformation of the sector also?
Okay, thank you, Mari. Thank you for the questions. Yes, as a national ID program, that we understand that addressing the challenge faced by service providers goes beyond offering an identification solution. So we firmly believe that all sectors to truly benefit from our national ID system, a comprehensive digital transformation is necessary. So we are taking proactive steps to address these challenges. As a key strategy, we are diversifying our service to accommodate the services that you mentioned, the services that do not have a sufficient infrastructure in place, the services that are experiencing vendor locking, and the services that are lacking in digital literacy. So what we did, for example, for the services that experience vendor locking, we provide a client-side application that's specifically designed to demonstrate seamless third-party integration with the reservoir libraries. So this client-side application will help the service providers that do not fully understand the system they are using to integrate with us with simple or minor modification in their system side. So by doing so, we provide a flexible solution that can be easily adopted to different systems and technologies. So this will help us to minimize the impact of vendor locking. Instead of them studying our system, studying their system, and providing an integration platform, we provide them the integration platform. They will only need to minorly adjust their system. In addition to that, there are sectors also who do not have the infrastructure at all. They are operating manually. They don't have a digital system to integrate with us. So for those sectors, we are developing an offline authentication app where these service providers can install in their smartphone devices and able to authenticate their customers. For example, in our physical ID, we provide basic biographic information of the individual in addition to a QR code. So the QR code contains basic information of the individual in addition, along with the face photo of the individual. So service providers who do not have a sophisticated digital system will be able to use our authentication app and scan that QR code to authenticate their customer. This authentication app will help them to verify the authenticity of the card and also verify the authenticity of the person who's standing in front to get a service. So as a national ID program, we are catering our services based on the service providers we are integrating with. As I mentioned earlier, for service providers that face vendor locking, we provide a specific API, integration API, and for the service providers who do not have a sufficient infrastructure, we provide an offline authentication app until they get that sufficient technological infrastructure.
Thank you so much, Bethlehem. That's very impressive. And it's actually a lot of additional work on top of actually developing an ID system. But as mentioned during the workshop, it's actually critical. Otherwise, the ID system will not be able to be used in the country. During the session, you also mentioned the fact that service providers were asking for additional data to be collected by the ID system. In very brief words, would you be able to say what is the National ID Program stance on this matter?
So as a national ID program, we are following the data minimization principle for two reasons. One is collecting all sector-specific data is not safe for the individuals. They will be exposed to targeted attacks, and also for us to collect an information that is not needed to identify a person is a wastage of resource and a wastage of time. And also, as a program, we are targeting to reach 85 million registration by 2025. So if we try to collect sectoral information into our database, it will take us more than 10 years to register all the residents in Ethiopia. So due to the mentioned reasons, we are avoiding collecting extra information other than identity informations.
Thank you so much, Bethlehem. So indeed, also very important from an inclusion point of view. I will bring now Matthew from Co-Develop to the floor. Hi, Matthew. So during you intervened actually for all the different parts of the workshop, but I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what is the most effective way to build trust with service providers, and what would be the pitfall actually to avoid in this process?
Absolutely. Thanks, Marie, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the colleagues that are on the call. I think this is a really important question, and I think, you know, part of the challenge with this around thinking about effective ways to work with service providers and build trust is also acknowledging or keeping in mind that building trust with service providers is also related to building trust with users and the general public. All of those are important to actually building the confidence of service providers that they should be investing in a particular foundational ID system that a government is introducing. And so if there isn't confidence in the ecosystem, then the incentives for the service providers will be low, both to join the initiative as well as to sustain their investments and engagements with the ID ecosystem. And so, you know, for me, what that means is that when we're thinking about effective ways of building trust with service providers, we have to look at that as from a broader perspective. And so a couple of things stand out that I think are useful to keep in mind. I think one is that transparency throughout the process is actually quite powerful. ID authorities can and have the ability to, and should be publishing white papers, publishing technical specifications, publishing other documentation throughout the process of design, implementation, and scaling. That both provides context, not just for the service providers, for what the broader ecosystem, and helps people to demystify aspects of the process. And that's one of the powerful ways that I think trust can be built. Another one is collaboration. This follows very much from this idea of transparency. And I think this, you know, many of those documents that we mentioned above, you know, the process by which those documents are created should be collaborative. And an important aspect and dimension of that collaboration is a diversity of inputs. And so, you know, whether that's not just from the service providers, but also from civil society and other groups that are representative of a broader set of society. Those things are very important because what that does as the country is working through the design of these systems is that when those broad perspectives are included, the likelihood that the system is going to be non-inclusive or have issues that disproportionately affect users, all of those things, one, undermine trust, and ultimately they may prevent even the service providers from adopting that system and the processes around that system that ultimately don't allow them to achieve the kind of outcomes that they want. And so that kind of diversity of input actually helps not just the ecosystem from a trust building perspective, the authority that is trying to design enrollment processes, grievance redressal, etc., but also the service providers that are in a process of now forming, or how am I integrating this new ID system into my ways of working? Mm-hmm. And then I think outside of collaboration, we've seen a couple of places where, you know, countries have used legal or regulatory approaches as well. I think
I was about to ask you actually if you have example of successful strategy or initiative of ID programs that have employed this collaboration approach.
Sure. So I think from a collaboration perspective, we've seen both, some countries, I mean, these are some of the common cases, both in India, Estonia, etc. They published a number of documentations, white papers that outlined key aspects of the system and explained them in quite clear ways. In Brazil, we saw with PIX, which is not necessarily ID, but another kind of digital public infrastructure. There were these series of community almost meetings that were had around specific aspects of the system that was being rolled out to discuss those challenges. And I think another example, and this goes into some of the legal, not so much collaborative, but regulatory, I think the useful points here is thinking about using these to address very targeted bottlenecks that might exist in the ecosystem. And so, you might exist in a place where, for example, there's very low trust in the ID options that are available. And so I've seen in a couple of countries where they've included in the law that the provision of this new ID is sufficient for establishing someone's legal identity. And so and such that, service providers or other entities aren't allowed to ask for additional things to be able for someone to identify who they are. So there are a couple of different approaches to building trust in the ecosystem, both on the user side as well as service providers, that I think we can think about.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Very interesting discussion with you and Bethlehem. And there is actually example out there of how governments are engaging with public and private service providers, and also with the public, and that it actually demonstrates that the success of an ID project or even a digital public infrastructure solution is actually relying on this collaboration. So it's very important to engage at the early stage of a project. That being said, we will move now to the third part of our livecast, focusing on how to convene the different stakeholders and mobilize them around this idea of building a coherent digital public infrastructure that is actually used by people and by public and private services. This came, we were surprised because when we actually asked the contributors to the workshop in Nairobi, we got a reply that it's actually not so difficult to convene and engage with stakeholders. But after the discussion, we realized that actually it's not always easy and a lot of challenge can arise. So we gave the example of a government-to-person program and illustrated on how many different stakeholders have to get involved, from putting in place the social assistance program, making sure the beneficiaries are identified correctly, to building the infrastructure to actually transfer the funds and making sure that this is delivered effectively. And finally, the fact that how do you give the cash payment to people on the ground in remote areas like Esther mentioned, etc. And just to give you an example, when we talk, for example, about the social assistance program, how to set it up, there's a lot of background discussion between different stakeholders that will come in play. For example, the Social Protection Ministry would have this request of how can we identify the people most in need, and they will have to actually collaborate with other ministries that own the data that will enable them to establish the eligibility of people. So for example, the Ministry of Taxation will say that they can check the revenues for potential beneficiaries, but maybe they will say we actually need a way to share this safely. So there is a lot of requirements also on their side to contribute to this objective of delivering more efficiently the cash payment to people in the country. And again, also the ID agency would be saying, sure, we can guarantee the uniqueness of the beneficiaries, but we need to have some sort of guarantee on our side that you will use the data correctly. So a lot of different needs, a lot of different requirements from the different stakeholders. And so in terms of key insights from the discussion during the workshop, was that it's very important for the government to focus on creating an enabling environment, not only from a legal point of view, but also from offering platforms, digital public infrastructure that can be reused by the public, but mainly also by the private sector to deploy new technologies or offer better service delivery. Because we discussed that the private sector is better at actually being agile and adopt new ways of serving people. And the conclusion was for the governments to do less and not more, but focus on what is actually important to steer this innovation on the service provider side. The second insight was to actually have a clear vision at the highest level of leadership in the country. This was essential for building a successful digital public infrastructure because it serves as a guiding force to ensure that all stakeholders are actually having a coherent approach to this development and making sure that the individual projects and roadmaps are contributing to the same goal and working and being interoperable between each other. And finally, we also discussed the governance aspect on how to ensure this alignment between different stakeholders. And again, the notion of collaboration came into play, highlighting that it must be continuous because a digital public infrastructure, or more specifically an ID system, is something that we need to remain adaptable to change and cater for the evolving needs of the public, of the service providers, and making sure that it's actually able to implement improvements that are coming back from the feedback of people using the system. That is very important, and that we discussed during the first part of this webinar. So now I'm calling on Aimé from the Agence pour le développement du numérique de la République démocratique du Congo, and Pramod from the Center for DPI. You can switch on actually your camera. And I wanted to start actually with a question for Pramod, who made a very impactful presentation during the workshop. And one of the things that you actually presented, Pramod, is this graph about the success of the Indian story. More specifically, you discussed while presenting this slide about how digital public infrastructure is a way to provide and actually balance the notion of inclusion and innovation. And so, in your opinion, Pramod, what role should government play when investing in digital public infrastructure to ensure interoperability, privacy, but also fair competition?
Thank you, Marie. So digital public infrastructure, and we discussed this on that day, it's not same as digitization. And this is one common mistake people tend to have, that I'm doing a digital project, so is that DPI? And we did discuss that day, that DPI thinking is more infrastructure in nature, more enabling in nature, and you want to have innovators build solutions on top of your infrastructure, rather than you becoming the only provider, only builder, and only solution provider to the entire system. So the DPI thinking by design has to be interoperable, minimal, and not solution-centric, more infrastructure-centric. That means building blocks in nature and not solutions in nature. So the people, the departments, or your question on what can government do? First of all, DPI doesn't have to be done by government at all. It can be done by, it's in public interest, any interest, but typically enabled by government, or at least blessed by the government, because you need to, or the regulator. When I use the government, I also mean government/regulator, because without that, you don't get national scale and national adoption and national legal and legislative support and administrative support. So blessing is necessary. Now, the real idea of DPI is to do the least and get the most out of it. No, that's very, very different from a traditional digitization program, where you tend to write some very complex RFPs and choose a vendor and build the whole system. And only the vendor is actually building a mobile app, vendor is building a portal, vendor is building your database, and vendor building everything for you, right? In the case of DPI thinking, you are actually asking yourself as a government, first question you have to ask, what is the least that you have to build so that others can build more on top of that? So the minimalism, the idea of minimalism, and our Ethiopian friend, she talked about being extremely minimalistic, even in the ID. ID is the most somewhat controversial or most talked about because most government-ish in one sense project. Beyond ID, payment and the other layers when you start taking is less to do with government and more to do with enabling. So what do you need to do? What does our government need to do to enable a playground for DPI, for innovation to happen? And second question you have to ask is that the DNA of the organization cannot be of a builder or a player, rather of an enabler and a facilitator. And now that's at least in India, we have seen that it's tricky, frankly. Government ministries and departments tend to work in silos, and collaboration is not their natural thing to do. And I would rather do it myself than depending on someone else to do is the typical. So now that's counterproductive, because if you're going to do everything, you are the playground maker, you are the player, you are the rule setter, and you are everything, right? That doesn't work. That's typically against the ethos of DPI. So you ought to have a DNA of a facilitator. I think it's very, very key. But very important thing that come to innovation and inclusion is that sustenance of any technology for the next 5-10 years cannot be done only by government. So sustenance and continuous innovation cannot be done by one party. I think that is a very important mental model we ought to have, because we don't know the future. We ought to have everyone having the ability to build and compose solutions. So government ought to build building blocks like Lego blocks, and someone else build the solutions around by combining them. And that is a mental model you ought to have, right, for DPI thinking. So why is it important to have innovation by the ecosystem? Is that if you assume there is only one solution for the whole country for the next 10 years, which is done by a vendor, which I'm going to pay for, the whole modeling is wrong. Mental model is wrong. We ought to assume the future is unknown. Future is going to be disruptive. And then we need to find many, many solutions. And so we need to enable solution building. If that is a mental model, then you are basically arguing is that inclusion comes from those innovations and not only from me. That's the assumption they are making. That the inclusion is not because I did everything, because I laid the playground for others to bring innovative solutions. So that also provides sustainability and also dramatically reduces cost. One of the biggest takeaway in DPI ought to be that you actually have to do very little. You actually have to spend very little, but you can create this non-linear effect, this graph you're showing, that exponential effect. If only you can bring market, societal actors, and other government departments to use your building block. That's tricky. It's not straightforward as you can imagine, but that's the only way to sustain and scale and deal with the unknown future.
Thank you very much, Pramod. And indeed, you explaining how the government can be an enabler and not necessarily an implementer of the DPI. But this importance of the government as steering this discussion and this vision. What would be the strategies that you would recommend for government to actually convene the stakeholders? Because in the previous parts, we mentioned the need to listen to the people, the need to listen to the private service providers. How can you actually do that and go beyond the silos that you mentioned in your first intervention?
And we hear this when I travel around. I hear this many, many times, including European countries. I was in Europe last week. And they say we had to mandate. So the idea of mandate is such a strong notion in the government that I will mandate the idea, I'll mandate this and I'll mandate that. And that's completely against the idea of a natural incentive, right? And how can you sustain by mandating? So you have to find the incentives. Incentive for whom? Incentive for users, incentive for other solution builders, incentive for other departments, incentives for banks to use your ID, incentive for everyone else. So incentive-driven adoption is much better way to do. Now, so one tool or one approach to do this is to separate the government who is interested in doing this to another party who is facilitating. You don't have to have government officials necessarily implementing and facilitating. So in India, much of the digital public infrastructure, much of it, payment and data and DigiLocker, credentialing, now commerce and everything else we are doing, are done by not-for-profit entities, blessed by the government or regulator, set up for a purpose to purely become a facilitator of this ecosystem. And our entire data network is all done by that way. And it's a very interesting model because that allows that network facilitator to be arm's length from the government, but much closer to the real users. So that, and they don't have the mandate or the legal mandate to say, you shall use, because they are, by design, they are a facilitator and not a mandator. I mean, in one sense, right? They don't have the legislative power, which is a good thing, according to me. And so you give the facilitating, or you create these, what we in India, we refer to them as national information utilities. These are utility companies, information utility companies in one sense. Then I use a digital DPI utility company, whatever you want to call it. But these are actually not for profit by nature, and they are facilitating in nature, and they connect the government on one side to the actual users on the other side, instead of government trying to do all that thing. And they do that. We have a reasonable playbook on doing that, because that not-for-profit entity now can convene. And actually, as you are right, convening is not the difficult part. Convening is not difficult at all to convene in any reasonable. It's about convincing. So convening is easy. They'll all attend the convening, but they won't make the move because either you are trying to force it, or you are trying to convey the message in your own language, not in their language. I'll give you an example. In identity system, when we were ID system, we went to our central bank and we asked the central bank, why don't you open bank account using the ID authentication? And they did not understand the need for it at all. So they were saying, why do we need it? We don't need it. So in fact, we were so far apart to convince them, but we had to go back and articulate from their adopters' value. So it's called value articulation, not a feature articulation. And almost always we explain the features of the ID project or features of payment, and not necessarily the benefit or the value of why should you adopt. Now this takes a little bit of an effort, because if you are explaining to a politician, you need to explain it differently. And if you are explaining to a bureaucrat in a social protection project, you would explain it differently. If you are explaining to an economist in the regulator, in a banking regulator, for example, you have to explain slightly different. And if you are to a civil society, you have to explain it slightly differently, because each of them come with a mental world model in their mind. And they are almost looking at you saying, why should I adopt you? That's the first question, right? I don't see any reason to adopt. So I think there is an importance of value articulation is needed, and facilitation is needed. And what the third tool we use is, do not try to convince everybody at all. You cannot convince everybody in the beginning at all. You utterly fail. So don't try to do this democratic, let's convince everybody approach. Rather, this facilitating organization should simply say, there are always some early movers. In every society, you will find few leaders and few challengers and early movers who are ready to come along with you, because they get their pain points. You are solving their pain points in one sense, and they will make the first move. And let it be slow. But once the adoption starts, the FOMO sets in, fear of missing out sets in, and everybody starts coming in. And this is why mandating never works for any exponential adoption. Everything you see in India, an exponential, none of them were mandated, including UPI. Even today, banks have no mandate at all to join UPI. So you have to really ask, Well, then why did they join? Why did 350 banks join in the first 4 years, 3 years itself, if it is not mandated?
Mm-hmm.
So that is where the incentive structure. So my suggestion is the threefold thing. Create an institution, a facilitating institution, arm's length from government, so they can bridge the gap between the users, adopters, and the government. And second, create incentive alignment and incentive value articulation for what you are trying to do, not a feature articulation and not a mandated approach, incentive driven value articulation. Third, look for asynchronous adoption. That means find a few early movers and move on with it. Don't worry about others joining. Others will start joining when they start seeing value. Until the value is realized, they won't join.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Pramod, for this insight. And I think one of the things that you mentioned about the experience of India in setting up non-for-profit organization is actually illustrating the point that was concluding during part one, that it's also important to put organizations that have the actual skills that are needed to engage. And I think the fact of having these separate entities is also putting into place this approach of having the right skills to engage with the different services and develop services that would be and systems that would be fit for purpose. So saying that, I would like to give now the floor to Aimé from the Agency for the Numeric Digital Development. I'm trying to translate from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Hi, Aimé. So you were a contributor during the workshop, and you actually, at the end, during this discussion, you emphasized that many ID projects actually fail because they overlook the specific needs of the different sectors when it comes to identification. They don't do this process that we discussed during part two of doing this analysis. And would you be able to elaborate how DRC actually foster collaboration with various stakeholders for their ID projects? And I think we also had a graph that we wanted to show that we discussed during the workshop, where we had a good example from DRC on how the usage of mobile money actually increased drastically during COVID time, but not because people wanted to have cash transfer, but because actually the requirement for KYC was reduced because that was a key barrier for adoption. The demand was here, but there were still barriers that were lifted and enable this adoption. So would you be able to tell us more about what DRC is doing in this domain?
Okay. Merci beaucoup. Merci au docteur Joseph Attic et à tous les membres, notamment à Marie, pour nous avoir associés à ce travail. En ce qui concerne la RDC, c'est vraiment une situation, je vais dire, innovante, comme l'a dit le docteur tout à l'heure, le docteur Pradmod, voilà, qui veut dire que l'innovation, l'inclusion provient de l'innovation. Et effectivement, au niveau de la RDC, comme vous le savez, les derniers recensements datent de 1984. Alors,
un instant, je vais traduire. Si vous voulez bien faire des phrases courtes pour que je puisse traduire au mieux votre intervention. Merci. Thank you very much, Dr. Attic and all the members, and also Mary for having me join this conversation and for the present work. Indeed, this present situation is about innovation, and as Dr. Pradmod has indicated, inclusion comes from innovation. The previous census that we have had in the country was in 1984.
Évidemment, donc, c'est en 1984 que la RDC a fait ses derniers recensements. Donc, je le souligne bien ici pour notamment montrer ce que je vais expliquer par la suite.
So indeed, the DRC has done the last census in 1984, and this is important to understand what we will explain next.
Donc, alors, à ce jour, au niveau de la RDC, pour notamment montrer qu'il y a eu une forte inclusion, c'est qu'il y a eu une mise en place d'une commission mixte qui a permis d'élaborer un rapport qui a abouti à la mutualisation des opérations d'identification, de recensement et de l'enrôlement des électeurs.
So recently there has been inclusion process set up that has included a mixed strategy into operating and providing identification and enrolling the entire population.
Okay. Donc cette commission a permis de réunir les efforts afin notamment de diminuer le coût pour que ces trois opérations mutualisées atterrissent à une approche qui soit inclusive, qui soit propre et cohérente, afin de permettre de mettre en place des next steps. Voilà.
This commission has united efforts to be able to save money, and three operation groups have been mutualized, have been grouped to have a clean and coherent operation into the registration process.
Donc, à ce jour, ici, il y a une première phase qui a été amorcée, notamment l'enrôlement des électeurs, qui a abouti à un fichier qui récemment a été audité.
So the first phase has started with the enrollment of the electorate, the people who would participate in the elections.
En fait, cet enrôlement est très nécessaire, notamment au regard de contraintes constitutionnelles. Donc, il fallait exactement commencer par là. Et le fichier qui a été audité aujourd'hui a été transmis aux organes compétents pour faire l'identification et l'enregistrement.
This enrollment was much needed due to constitutional constraints, but the file was pushed forward for identification and enrollment of populations.
Donc, cela constitue notamment une base pour les prochaines étapes qui constituent notamment à mettre en place un fichier général de la population. Comme je l'ai dit en introduction, c'est que la RDC n'a jamais eu, depuis 1984, il n'a jamais fait de recensement. Donc, cette opération, en fait, ces fichiers-là va constituer une base pour mettre en place le fichier général de la population. Et c'est sur base de ça que les différentes opérations vont être effectuées.
So the base to this entire process and the next step, it's constituting the general registry of the population, because as mentioned, no census had been done since 1984. So this registry will be the base to the new identification system and to the different operations that will follow.
Pour essayer un peu de mettre en lumière les défis que nous avons aujourd'hui en RDC, c'est que le privé ont suffisamment évolué. Donc, quand je parle des privés, je parle des télécommunications, des opérateurs de télécommunications, les banques, les sectoriels. Ils ont suffisamment évolué en termes notamment de l'identification, de l'enrôlement de leurs clients. Mais au niveau national, il n'y a pas encore une base. Donc, l'objectif, c'est d'arriver à produire ces fichiers généraux de la population qui va servir à tout l'écosystème, afin que nous ayons un système unique et unifié d'identification.
So one of the difficulties that we have had at DRC has dealt with the fact that the private sector is much more developed. The communication services and telecommunication companies, the banks and all sectorial services have evolved at different speed than the enrollment, and it has it does have to evolve to assure a national base and registration, and the goal is to establish that national registry that will be able to serve all the service providers.
And maybe, Amy, if I can actually follow up on the point that you just made about the relationship with the bank and the telecom sector. So indeed, often the governments are putting requirements, regulatory requirements on those sectors to verify the identity. And you mentioned that there's no population registry yet in the country to actually verify this identity. So how is actually DRC collaborating with these specific stakeholders, the bank and the telecom sector, to make sure that the solution that will be developed by the government is actually replying to the needs? And I guess the interpreter can translate the question.
Oh,
I can say it in French.
Okay, I'm not sorry.
Is it okay, Amy? Amy, est-ce que je peux la répéter en français?
Ok, il n'y a pas de souci.
Donc, en fait, je vous demandais, vous avez parlé du secteur télécom et bancaire et le fait qu'ils ont des règles en termes de vérification d'identité des personnes. Et à la fois, vous avez indiqué que le gouvernement, malheureusement, n'a pas encore de registre de la population qui permet de vérifier cette identité. Donc, la question était comment actuellement la RDC engage ces acteurs qui ont des besoins très spécifiques. Comment cette collaboration se fait-elle?
Merci beaucoup, Marie. En fait, si vous vous rappelez, ou plutôt si je dois mettre à votre disposition cette information, c'est que la RDC, depuis plus de 10 ans, a utilisé les systèmes d'enrôlement des électeurs comme une base d'identification de la population.
If you can recall, and I have made this information available, the question is that at the beginning, most of the population enrollment was based in the electoral registration.
Donc, depuis toutes ces années, voilà, c'est vraiment un système précaire d'identification, mais l'objectif ici, c'est d'aller dans un système cohérent, donc le fichier général de la population.
So this was a very initial and way of identification, very precarious. And the objective now is to go towards a more broad way of population identification.
Donc, depuis tout ce temps, la collaboration qui est faite avec les télécommunications, les banques, les hôpitaux et même les services de sécurité, les services d'immigration, c'est sur base du fichier de l'enrôlement des électeurs, le fichier qui a été audité lors des précédentes élections. Ces mêmes fichiers-là a servi comme une base d'identification précaire pour permettre notamment au pays de fonctionner. Mais sinon, avec cette nouvelle approche, l'objectif, c'est vraiment de mettre en place ces fichiers généraux de la population pour permettre aux banques, aux télécommunications, d'avoir, au fait, de s'assurer de l'identité de leurs clients. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, il y a pas mal quelques écarts, je veux dire, en termes notamment des erreurs. Voilà.
So as we have mentioned before, it is important throughout time to improve that because of the communication with the telecom, with the bank, the hospitals, and even the security. As mentioned before, the previous system was quite precarious and based on the voters' registration from the previous elections. And we need something that would be more functional, a new approach to ensure the identity of all the clients, of all the users, to make sure that there wouldn't be so many errors in the next steps.
Peut-être pour conclure, c'est que ce processus aujourd'hui est très avancé. Donc, il va certainement produire ses fruits et ça va permettre une grande inclusion. Déjà, au niveau du gouvernement, comme je crois que vous le savez, c'est qu'il y a déjà un effort qui est fait pour mutualiser les opérations. C'est déjà un bon départ en termes d'inclusion. Donc, le reste, ça va être des surcouches qui vont être construites en fait, d'assurer notamment cette interopérabilité avec les secteurs privés et les ONG.
To conclude, this process is quite advanced now, and it has been very fruitful. It has allowed inclusion, and it has shown the government efforts to mutualize and to provoke this inclusion through mutualization. And we have also worked on several layers that would be interoperable and will be collaborating from including private sector and NGOs.
Thank you so much, Aimee, for these insights. And I think we really look forward in the upcoming years to see the impact of this collaboration approach that you've been putting into place in DRC, and how this actually, translates on the ground for people and for the service providers. I'm actually looking at the time, and I think we're reaching the end of our session. I would have still a lot of questions for our wonderful speakers, and I want to again thank you, all of you, for participating today. Just to mention that the World Bank is working on this toolkit to help countries to put into place use cases that are fit for purpose, for the needs of the people and for the needs of the service providers. So stay tuned on that. We will publish it on our website and actually publish this online on social media. So thank you again very much. And Joseph, I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you for being on time. And thank you, Julia, for all the wonderful work that you've put to make this a very successful workshop. We've got a lot of positive feedback on it. And I think this session, summarizing some of the key lessons, will go very, very far in reinforcing the notion that this was a great workshop. So thank you again. Operator, we're ready to move on to the next segment, which is essentially, we are going to do something different this time, but we are going to try to summarize workshop 3. In that case, I'd like to start by inviting to the stage the 3 chairpersons, Fumeng Liu, Bhaskar Mishra, representing UNICEF, and Edward Dafis, representing OpenCRVS. The 2 institutions shared the chairmanship of the workshop. It was a very different workshop than workshop 1 in its objectives, and involved a lot of discussions and issues that are not clear about how we should proceed as a community. So the best thing to do is for us to start by asking the chairpersons, maybe we can start with UNICEF, to frame the workshop and give us a high-level perspective on what happened, how did it go in your perspective, not too much detail, just a perspective, and start by reminding the audience about what was the workshop about, what was the objective. So anyone from UNICEF, either Fumeng or Bhaskar, and then we'll go around.
Thank you, Joseph. It's like you mentioned, the workshop was really trying to tease out an idea that we never really teased out before, which is having an Africa eCRVS shared assets. So together with my co-chairs, we went in prepared. And it was, to me, it was really encouraging to see the responses from the room, especially we have more than 20 country representatives, partners from the World Bank, Co-Develop, and Vital Strategies and so forth, giving us really, really good feedback. One of the things that I think actually re-verify some of the challenges that we see in digitizing CRVS from fragmented data perspective, whereby governments have siloed databases and things are not sharing with each other, especially when it comes to birth registration. The lack of user centricity, some of the countries actually shared with us during the workshop, whereby they are seeing some archaic policies and processes not being updated, and that actually caused mothers not be able to register their child along the line. And the list goes on from, lack of regulation on data privacy and protection. And one thing that came out over and over again is about vendor login, which prevent the governments of getting the data. So we hear all of this perspective from the countries, and it was really, really good to hear the challenges, and from the co-chair's perspective, we wanted to see how the notion of Africa eCRVS shared assets can be teased out. So we started with sharing our ideas or some of our experience about having core design principles, whether it is from design for scale to make sure that systems are interoperable together, especially when, in this case, CRVS system, and adopting open standards for data and sharing, protect the privacy and security of the users and the data. And the third one being making sure that ensure inclusion in the design of ACSA, the Africa eCRVS shared asset, because we know that without users coming along, the asset would not be successful if we were to start this journey. So I did the part about design principles, and my co-chairs from OpenCRVS and my colleague from UNICEF has also done their part. So this is my sharing and my takeaway. I think it was very, very encouraging to see. It was a very good start. We just started the journey, and I will hand over to Bhaskar and or Ed in this case to share their key takeaways as well.
So we'll come back to the discussion of the challenges, etc. But what I'd like to hear is sort of frame the Bhaskar. Maybe you can frame the workshop.
Yeah. So thank you, Joseph, for giving this opportunity. It's always a pleasure to be here. And overall, the concept of the African CRVS shared asset, an asset owned and managed by Africans, was well received. However, as you know, the idea of developing a shared asset is not new. It is aligned with the Agenda 2060, Africa We Want. It is also in line with some of the aspirations and recommendations of the Conference of Ministers. Now we have, like 5, and we are waiting for the 6th one. Additionally, the African Union, UNICA, UN Legal Identity Agenda have called for a uniform and standard approach to digitization of CRVS systems and emphasize the need for South-to-South cooperation and learning from one another. You remember digitization through the innovative and safe use of technology also featured as a thematic area during last year's ID4Africa supported workshop Mission 100 towards achieving 100% legal identity. So to this end, this workshop aimed to deliberate on some of the issues and challenges that have been discussed to address them through a shared approach. It is about developing an African CRVS asset that all of us contribute to and advocate for. The initiative has 3 buckets, as Fumeng said: design principles, focusing on both technological and non-technological solutions, digital CRVS solution or stack, which is the fulcrum of the shared asset. The idea is to follow a consortium approach to take advantages of good features of open source, proprietary, and homegrown solutions and offer it to countries free, and with a mechanism to provide regular support in conjunction with in-country resources. Ed is going to talk about the key architects of the digital solution. The third bucket is about establishing an advisory body to provide technical and oversight support to this process. It was a lively discussion. Participants provided excellent suggestions and raised quite a few pertinent queries. And we are hopeful that today's discussion will help to get more clarity in terms of business processes and also in terms of implementation modalities. So let me stop here and give the floor to Ed.
Thank you very much, Bhaskar. To continue the framing of this session. Well, firstly, in fact, what I want to do is, I thought, Joseph, it was really pertinent that this session related to the African Civil Registration Shared Asset comes after the session on DPI. I don't want to miss the opportunity to point out that a digital civil registration system is a critical part of this infrastructure, and this is the changing landscape at the moment. Where a digital civil registration system is an enabler and a part of the foundational identity ecosystem, to build on Pramod's point about, DPI thinking, etc. So I think that, that's great just to follow on from that session. Look, in terms of the session itself, certainly it's very exciting and a timely initiative. OpenCRVS is extremely pleased to be able and humbled to be a co-host of this group. and the workshop. Very pleased to be able to support this, what must be African-led project, bringing our experience of digital civil registration, to bear as it's required by African countries. I think there's a lot of energy and interest from the countries that we saw in the room during the workshop. At the same time, there's a lot to be figured out. The essence of creating common assets also, by definition, also requires a degree of harmonization. And that was there in the room as well. Trying to get our heads around that. We know that a lot of countries have their own specific laws, processes, and systems, etc. So this will need significant willpower and vision across Africa to get this moving. There's just one other thing I just want to sort of to help set this up as well, in terms of these assets. So back in 2015, we did a piece of work as part of the African program for the accelerated improvement of CRVS, which was the CRVS digitization guidebook, quite a long time ago now, 2015. And what that did was it really created and documented a step-by-step guide for how a country can plan for, analyze, implement, and support a digital civil registration system. And there's clearly appetite for, and that's an asset of sorts, of course. There's clearly appetite for them. I was just checking, we get over 2,000 users, per month around the world using, the digitization guidebook. So there's clearly something in it. And the next set of assets, which we're really proposing here, and I'm sure we'll come back to unpack this a little bit more in this session, these reusable standards, best practices, technology components even, that can support digital transformation of civil registration systems across Africa. These are the missing pieces, if you will, of that digitization guidebook, because the guidebook explained the process, but now we want to append to that a set of standards, etc., which countries, particularly in Africa, can refer to. So I'll just leave things, just to kick things off there.
Yeah, I mean, let me try to focus a little bit on the scope, just to make sure, because there was a lot of confusion about how does an initiative about CRVS be launched without sort of stepping on other initiatives. The field is filled with many initiatives, as you well know. I want to emphasize that the scope, at least originally when the development partners got together, ID4Africa with UNICEF and with OpenCRVS and UNECA, the discussion focused really on the development of an asset that would be a resource that's available to countries, but not on necessarily reforming civil registration practices from a political point of view. I mean, we wanted to create assets that along the way, as countries reform, they can pick from the shelf and they can accelerate the reform process. But in no way this initiative was supposed to replace the comms or supposed to replace the APAI initiative. Was that clear at the workshop when you presented it to the audience, which was well subscribed? Was it clear that this is not a replacement, but a supplement in this very specific narrow way? Maybe Bhaskar, you can address if you may.
Yeah. So the answer is yes or no. Okay, I think we saw some clarity. Okay, like CRVS is not rocket science, Joseph. Like several countries in Africa have done it. And
right.
So it was all about developing something that can be replicated across settings, across countries. Like, and to avoid fragmentation, which unfortunately remains the biggest problem in Africa and also in South Asia. Okay, despite India and Pakistan leading the digital landscape, okay, but still these two countries also face a lot of challenges. Okay, so idea was to bring something together that can be, like to provide one one-stop window solution to countries rather than countries going here and there. And as you know, that we also, like the donor agencies, we also complicate the landscape, both in terms of understanding and by bringing different products. So we thought that we are already in 2023. If we have to meet the target of SDG 16.9, and we know that digitization is one of the accelerators, and we have good examples. Look, Rwanda, like from 52% to like 88%. So we have other countries that have really made good achievement in a shorter span of time, and thanks to digitization. So that was the idea. It was nothing to do with replacing something which is already on the ground, because that's not going to work. Okay, so it's all about bringing, like taking things together to offer as a combined, a comprehensive package to countries. Thanks.
So Ed, from your perspective, and then Fuming, from your perspective, where was the confusion about what the scope of this initiative was? If there is any. I mean, Bhaskar, you suggested that there was yes and no understanding of the scope. How did you feel that the audience were leaning when it comes to the scope?
I think if I may come in.
Yes, come in.
Joseph, like you mentioned during the beginning of the session, this is one of the first times that we actually shared with the workshop attendees. So there were a lot of intrigue questions and there were a lot of interest. But for us to really get every country buy-in, we need to go through the process, not only just to share the ideas, but also bring them in so that they could really understand and contribute to the creation of the asset, which I think, I'm so grateful that, we have this livecast, because this is one of the good opportunity that we can bring them in. So what I would say is that I think it would be a miracle that everyone in the room during the workshop say yes to it. And we know that for a fact. But we still believe that we see enough responses that actually attract the people from on this livecast now that could actually help us continue with this journey, and not saying that, not take the first workshop as a done deal. That would be my 2 cents on this.
Indeed. In fact, it's the first step in a multi-step process, which we'll understand a little bit better in a few minutes. And do you have anything else to add to that perspective?
Yes, definitely, because I think it's really important. So, and this is the uncomfortable nature of such a workshop. It's an African-led initiative. We have some ideas which are being, propositional, putting out there, etc. But the scope of the assets themselves need to be driven by the needs of the countries, and I know we'll come to hear from them shortly. So I think that's the necessary sort of tension in the room a little bit. And I think we all learned a lot from the feedback in terms of even talking through, hearing back from countries of what would be most valuable. My view of what the assets should be changed quite considerably during the course of the workshop. I can come on to that shortly, but I think what we did put forwards, based on a suggestion again by our friend from Togo, was quite rightly framing the problem. It was a necessity to do what? To frame the problem, and then put forwards a hypothetical value proposition of the assets. So what we came up with during the workshop and then afterwards was, the problem which we're facing. Fui Ming has already sort of referred to it a little bit, but the problem really is the fact that digital technologies, as Bhaskar said, a civil registration system is not the most complex system in the world, or shouldn't be, but digital technologies have a huge potential to transform CRVS systems. This is what we all believe, if effectively employed. And that means, what? It means complete and inclusive registration of all vital events, and using technologies, mobile technologies in particular, offline mode, etc., in rural locations to gather data. It means capturing high quality and meaningful data. It means providing, through interoperability, a trusted source of life events for the whole of government, putting it right at the heart of government service delivery, and even DPI, as I referred to at the beginning. Protecting personal data in a highly secure way, and making system implementation and maintenance easy. That should be what we aspire towards. But the problem part is we know this is not widespread across the continent. We have some countries who are a little bit behind. They're using paper-based or manual systems. There's fragmentation. There's various degrees of homegrown solutions. Some quite advanced, some less so. Some, dare I say it, probably not as secure as they should be. A lot of reinvention of the wheel, country by country, and therein lies the real point behind the assets. Reinventing the wheel through common assets. We can prevent that. And as was mentioned already, proprietary solutions which include vendor lock-in are also problematic as well. So yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So that's one part of the equation, as I was referring to, framing the problem statement. And I think that's quite a generic one. Interesting to see whether that indeed is based on what the countries would say on this call is indeed the problem. And then we look at the value proposition of shared assets, which I would describe as, and so I had to go even after the workshop, more precisely talking about what these assets could be. And my view is they will not be limited to technology assets and components, but actually a set of common and reusable standards, best practices, technology components to do what? To drive quality, to drive consistency, drive compatibility with other systems, and lower the total cost of ownership for digital CRVS. And there, in a nutshell, is 4 or 5 key words about what the value proposition should be. Ultimately, higher quality through use of reusable shared assets, accelerated implementation, getting to a digital CRVS system quicker, and lower the total cost of ownership. And all at the same time being Africa owned and meeting local needs.
Okay, so hold on to that. I'd like to bring in 2 experts who have spent their entire life working in Africa. And Cornelius Williams, who just retired from UNICEF, and of course William Mwava from UNECA. And I would like to get their perspective about, clearly the challenge of CRVS has been with Africa for the last 30 years. What are the odds that they see against an initiative across Africa, such as ACSA? And what do they see as the change drivers? Why do you think the timing could be right for Africa to undertake such an initiative? And then I'll go back to the technical team to try to understand a little bit more details about some of the common assets that could be generated, including the principles for harmonization and standardization and business practices. So Cornelius, if you're ready, share with us your perspective. You attended the workshop and you've been around for a while in this field. So please give us your perspective.
So let me start with the odds, okay? And some of the challenges. Is this another initiative? As you said, amongst other multiple initiatives, there is initiative fatigue, and countries usually, the Registrar General are busy people, and their agencies are busy people. And so they're focused on building their civil registration system and identity system in their country, where they have the space to lift up their gaze and take the leadership that is required for them to own this. The second issue, actually, these initiatives need some resources for it to take off. They need technical people to support a Registrar General who comes forward to show its leadership. For example, API was born because of the leadership of the Registrar General, okay, from South Africa. And then he mobilized other registrar general. And that's where the Conference of Ministers and everything. So member states lent support to it. Is there time? Is this a time for it? I think, as Ed has said, there is. Now, the first thing is we now see Africa, the Registrar General, have built-in capacity to provide each other with technical assistance. As Bhaskar mentioned, you have three approaches: the open solution, the proprietary, and the homegrown. We're seeing more homegrown solutions. How are these homegrown solutions developed? This is showing actually that Africa has the capacity. Two, if you have been part of this journey, the professionalism of the Registrar General, the understanding of the issues, the technical capacity, as I said, the ownership and the recognition without digitization, they are not going to achieve some of the goals that they aim to achieve. Third, the Registrar General have done an excellent job, ID4Africa, the Conference of Ministers, in educating the policymakers and the budget holders on the importance of civil registration. And as Ed said, it's good that it is coming after the next session. So we keep saying the message we were preaching to people who were talking about the digital public highway and things like that, all those kind of issues. It's now clear that without civil registration and the digitization of civil registration, you'll not be able to achieve these kind of goals. So the time is now, right? I think they're ready. My final point is, okay, there is a tension on us being agile, right? So the odds are there, the opportunities are there, the capacity is there, but there is a tension in us being agile and not being bureaucratic. And then it's to call for member states to step forward and show the championship and leadership for Pan-African initiative.
But Cornelius, I mean, agile is a very, very operative word, but how do you stay agile if you are dealing with consensus building and with existing structures that have for many, many years have failed in a way to become agile? I mean, is there a new break from the past that is allowing the countries to be agile? What's the change driver?
Well,
in agility.
In the workshop, actually, I mean, I'm not going to call the country, but they were there. They were reminding us of the failure of bureaucratic structures,
right,
and reminding us of some of the initiatives. And they want to own this. Now, how do we stay agile and stay connected? That's the issue. By staying agile is for the development partners to support the government with a small capacity to be able to move forward at their own pace, whilst not having to report to lengthy and bureaucratic committees, etc. At the same time, they have to stay connected to like the Conference of Ministers to make sure that actually the resolutions are supporting the action. So I wouldn't say we should form kind of a big group. I would say we should grow organically, get a coalition of the willing to move this forward. And the ask to my colleagues, actually, the development partners, is to provide support to the Registrar General.
And in what form is that support? Technical, financial, company? What is that support?
The two support. Technical, to kick it off, and then we should be able to mobilize resources for them. And of course, actually, we're all in this, so we should be able to mobilize resources for them to take this off.
And it sounds to me that you're talking about a bootstrapping approach. And basically, instead of building a structure and then imposing it, and you're talking about actually building success, starting with the country level and then having it coalesce to form a movement basically from bottoms up. Am I understanding how your vision is?
Exactly. Okay. If you build an elaborate structure, you'd spend all your time building the form,
right,
and not the product, right? So the way I see it, after many years of working on this, is, I mean, for us to be able to do the bootstrapping, as you said, a coalition of the willing. In that workshop, I had voices who were convinced that Africa needs harmonization, Africa needs standards, Africa needs a shared asset. And speaking to the younger people in the workshop, which the president of Kenya spoke about, I'm convinced the technical capacity is there.
Is there. Okay, and that's a very good positive message. William, give us your perspective and UNECA's perspective on this. You were there at the workshop, and you heard some of the voices, similar voices, and others that Cornelius heard. So give us some color and perspective on that.
Thank you so much. My colleagues have actually said a lot of the things which really we deliberated during the workshop, after the workshop, and we have continued to deliberate on them. One of the things I think which I need to highlight is that this issue of the shared asset is actually something which we have been discussing for quite some time. Ed can remember that it was initiated in black and white at the 4th conference in Nouakchott, where it was agreed that the ECA would be encouraged to lead the development of a common ICT asset to support effective CRVS across Africa, ensuring the highest standard of data protection, confidentiality of personal data, in order to promote interoperability among civil registration, health, identity management systems to meet needs of all African countries. And I should underline the word all, because the approach then has been, let's carry everybody. But I think over the years, we have actually seen that that is a very mammoth task, which leads me to sort of indicate some of the issues or problems which we have encountered along the way. So the issue of fragmentation has actually been, highlighted. And when we did the comprehensive assessments and we did try to convert them to strategic plans, one of the things was countries were coming with billions of dollars. And once you get, you start from there, you are bound to fail, because that amount of money cannot be, gotten even both from the government and support from the development partners and so forth. And one of the things we confronted, confronted us, was national ID in most countries was stronger than civil registration. A very interesting finding, because most of the government sort of support was actually going to national ID. And we know for obvious reasons, because national IDs are required for most of the functionalities and so forth. How could we turn that tide was one of the things we're actually confronted with, and we are still confronted with, because even our good performing countries, which I won't mention by name, if you look at the national ID and civil registration, they are quite unequal. Then the issue of coordination has also been, and if we are going into a common asset, that's one thing we have to look at. Who is going to coordinate? Who is going to provide the leadership? So we have gone through all these recommendations, outcomes, and so forth. But when it comes to coordination, leadership, and so forth, especially where you need the countries to actually, take ownership and start driving those processes. So those are some of the things we need to actually, look at. And lastly, what I might want to mention is this critical mass of, human resources. Surely it was mentioned that, we have young people on the continent, very good programmers, but it has to be looked strategically. How do you incorporate them? Because what we have seen where it has worked possibly is to actually make sure they are part of the system. So if we are going to go for a shared asset, where will these human resources be, stationed? Where will they be operating from? And from the way we had conceived it, and also which is a subject of debate, we thought if this common asset, a shared asset is actually being developed, it might be, since we have the sort of convening role, with a few resources available, we can accommodate those young people here, 10 or 20 of them, to actually do the actual work, because there will be supervision, there will actually be, we can reach out to countries from a common post and so forth and so forth. So some of these we need to, as I think my colleague said, we need to start interrogating them one by one and putting these bricks into place and say, we think this brick is firm enough, we put the next brick until we actually have this product. Thank you.
William, I think you raise very interesting and important points, but I was hoping that that you would come to me as a group and say, we think the way to proceed is going to be an agile development model where you don't concentrate people in any given location. You leverage what's happening in the development world where people can be anywhere and contribute in a collaborative way through the collaborative tools. As long as you build the right standards, then everybody could be working on a separate and different module, but they all are guaranteed to work together. So to me, Cornelius nailed the issue by saying we need to be agile, but agile is not just a question of the politics of it. Agile is also the question of the development of it. So agile development methodology might be what we're going to need. So what I'd like to do here is I'd like to bring in the 4 countries and sort of get the perspective. We have 4 countries from the 17 or 18 that were actually present. I will give Cornelius and William a little break off the screen, but we'll bring you back towards the end of the segment to get your perspective on the way forward. So what I like to do now is listen to the countries who have attended the workshop, but who are also been listening to this conversation so far. And I will start, we'll have Rosemary from Uganda, then I'll go to Togbe from Togo, then I will go to Tilemeki from Namibia, and then Janabu from Guinea. So Rosemary, let me start with you, and sort of, you're the head of the Identity Authority. You govern a lot of issues related to identity. Uganda has been developing its civil registration infrastructure, and you're in the process of modernizing. How do you see the value of an asset, shared asset across the continent, and what would you like to see it consist of? I mean, just give us the end user perspective in the sense that you might be the one adopting it for your country. So does this make sense, or this is just yet another initiative and we don't need?
Thank you, Dr. Atik. Well, I would
start by answering the first question. Do we need this? And I will answer it with an example that is present in Uganda. In Uganda, we have 1.5 million refugees, probably one of the largest in the world. And we register births in refugee camps. And we register them using parameters that are common to our law. But you imagine that these children were identified in their country, and we had a common data set that we are sharing across the countries. After they were returning to their homes, it would be easy to send them back with some sort of identification. There would be no need for a double registration, identification, and subsequently, the SDG goal of legal identity for all would be easier to attain, even whether you are a refugee or not a refugee. So, a direct answer to your question is yes, we need this common shared platform or tool or whatever you want to call it. There are 54 countries in Africa. There are things that we share, without doubt. Every country has a name. Every country has coordinates of location. Every country has a flag. And I would like to liken that to the identifiers for birth registration. Across the continent, there are things that we share. Every child is born. Every child has a name. That date of birth is a fact around the continent. So there are already things that are common and shared. And that is why I'd like to pick up what William said on Agile. And for me, I would define Agile as starting with what is known and shared. Simple, two things I would say off the cuff is name and date of birth. They are global. There is a name, there is a date of birth. There are others like birth weight and several others. Every child has a parent. It doesn't matter where you are on the African continent. This is fact. So I think from an Agile perspective, this is to answer a question you've not asked. Is even if we began with the 3 common things we share and agree on, rather than trying to gather the 50 or the 100, even if we started with the 3, and then also agreed, what don't we share? And in building the model, we agree that this one has to be customized by nation. This we share, this has to be customized by nation.
Actually, elaborate this point, because what you just said is a profound statement, but even as simple as these data formats, I mean, there is divergence, right? I mean, explain a little bit of that, because I don't think all of the audience appreciate what you just said.
Okay, I will give a simple and classic example. There are many date formats, right, but they all have a year, they all have a month, and they all have a day. Some start with a year, some start with a day. So we could agree that we need a date of birth with 4 digits for the year, 2 digits for the month, and 2 digits for the day. However you arrange it, just give us your nomenclature. Now, I will give one that may not be shared across the country, across Africa. The fact of when a registration should occur. Some laws say 30 days after the birth. But there's a general consensus that should be 1 year. Can we agree that it should happen within 1 year across the continent? And if it is not agreed that it should happen 1 year, can we agree that that is configurable per nation? That particular part is configurable per nation. Now, those are the parameters. Now, the process will never be the same. So can we agree that with the parameters, factor them into your process? Like Legos, we all have yellow Legos, but build your car, the shape of your nation. But we all have similar small pieces of Lego. And where we're not shared, we could create a separate reference table or a separate area for configurable areas per nation. Because even after that, whether they are not, because it's what is not shared. What is not shared is process. What is not shared? Data elements, there are certain ones that are going to be uniform. I can guarantee 10 that will be uniform across the continent. The name, the date of birth, the parent's name, the father's name, the father's date of birth, the mother's name, the mother's date of birth, and a couple of others. So in essence, now the nomenclature for states or administrative units will not be the same across Africa. So we can agree that that is configurable per nation. So I want to use finally, as I conclude, the classic example of an SDG. An SDG is given at the UN level, legal identity for all. We are all given a goal, and we immediately begin to work towards that goal. The way Uganda does it is not the way Kenya does it, although we are working towards one goal. And that's where I would like to end this story. What is our goal? Because registration and identification are a how. What is our goal? Because we can at least share a goal. Even if everything fails, we can share a goal. Then the implementation of the goal will be a different thing. So in summary, there are things that are common. There are things that are shared. In order for us to increase globalization and trade in Africa, identification and movement of people needs to increase. Movement of people is driven by identification and information. The earlier this occurs, the better for all of us. We are saying, let's start it early for the children. And we are saying, when we start it early, we can share it. So in essence, we have a goal, we have a desire. And I agree with William strongly to say, let us start, even if it is only with one thing that we agree on. Just like the SDG. Let us start at that.
And that's a good thing to state, because the SDG is a set of goals that could harmonize. We could approach them differently in different places, but at the end of the day, it is a harmonization. You spoke even at a much more basic level, which is the level of defining identity and legal identity and the elements that constitute that, so that there's harmonization. The ACSA initiative was also going a little bit beyond that by saying maybe there are ICT assets that could be shared in order for the different countries to implement these goals. And so, yes, what you're saying, you have to start even more basic than the ICT assets. You have to start with the common goal and the common harmonization of defining what is shareable, interoperable, and what can be customized. Actually, the example that I like to use that inspires this is the e-passport, the data page of the passports. The entire world community spent 30 years and they got it right. They got it right a while back, but it was not right. If you look at the passports prior to the 1990s, there were a lot of different formats that passports, until the machine-readable passports came along. But there was an application that drove the harmonization, and that was essentially travel and the improvement of cross-border movement of people and air travel, etc. And there was an international organization, ICAO, which drove the harmonization exercise. So what we're saying here is something akin of that. We're looking to try to create a movement that harmonizes the civil registration practices so that they are completely interoperable no matter what country you are in. So you're basically saying, let's start even with the most basic so we can get off the ground before we reach to the ambitious point of having ICT assets that can be shared. So I appreciate that. Togbert, let me go to you and get your perspective from Togo regarding the need to harmonize and the need to create an African asset, and how did you react to the initiative at the workshop?
Thank you, Dr. Atik. First of all, in Togo, we think that ACSA is a very good initiative that will help move forward the CRVS on the continent. But we want to stress on the fact that we need to understand what we want to deliver through this initiative. Because I heard about data exchange, I heard about digital platform, I heard about so many different things, because even the declaration from the Conference of African Ministry responsible for civil registration is stating that the African country need to develop common ICT assets for CRVS, not specifically a digital platform that all African countries will use in order to achieve a good CRVS rate. So that was the point that was the point during the workshop. That is why we request that the problem statement was refined so that we understand what will be the outcome of the initiatives. But now, on the methodology, they say that there is 3 steps: design principle, the digital platform, and then the governance. For us, on the design principle aspects, we should say that maybe the outcome of this initiative will be a set of standards, a set of functional specification, and even a toolbox, because we are not all at the same level of readiness regarding technology, regarding legal framework, regarding change management, operational organization, and so on. So we need to focus on things that will be shareable amongst the different countries. So if we stay on the set of standard functional specification, toolbox available, people can start to say, okay, I have a legacy system, but with this specification, I can design an API exchange that will help to help the system to be interoperable with the health system, with the identity, even with the justice. So we don't put everybody on one platform or looking in the issue of how are we going to do that in countries where the technology readiness is not up. I'm not sure that those countries will be willing to use a cloud-based platform for eCRVS. So to summarize our thoughts or our position in Togo, for us, the outcome of ACSA should be a set of standard functional specification and a toolbox with all necessary means that will help countries to move quick in agile way. And of course, the governments also, it's very, very relevant. So we will also focus, we should also focus on the governance. Thank you.
Okay, very, very well said. Thank you for that perspective. We'll come back to it. Tulemeki, let's get Namibia's perspective. You've been very far advanced in your civil registration initiatives and even legal frameworks, etc. How did you view and react to the ACSA initiative, and how do you see it now?
Good afternoon, Dr. Atik, and hello to everybody. Dr. Atik, this is a really welcome initiative. I must admit, in the beginning, it was very exciting when I first heard of it. And then I got to sit and reflect, and I wondered, but how is this different from all the other initiatives that have been on the table? What is this coming to do that we have not been able to do with the other initiatives that have been there? And I think it was Cornelius earlier on who spoke about initiative fatigue, that we're sitting in a place where you were thinking, there is this meeting, there is the other conference, everything is talking about, every discussion is actually geared towards the same goal. But how do we get to harmonize all these initiatives so that it's less cumbersome in terms of administration, and it's also less cumbersome in terms of reporting? Mm-hmm. For Namibia, of course, and I agree with what my colleagues have said earlier on, that we are different. Yes, we are all gearing towards providing a legal identity for all, but we will not achieve it in the same way. Why don't we get around the table, which we have actually already done, because there are principles, there are standards, there are best practices, there are guidebooks on civil registration already. These things already exist. Why is it that we are still where we are? Why have we not moved? And I think this is where we get to sit around the table as Africa and learn from one another. What is it that Namibia is doing better than country X? What is it that country X is doing better than Namibia is doing, and how do we get to learn from one another? And I'm sure we can get to a place where we agree that in these areas, these countries are at this particular level and they can be assisted further because they're not at a level where we can say we have covered a bigger part of the population for them to receive a legal identity. What I was thinking of is, and I think it was also already sort of spoken to, having a one-stop window, actually having a shopping basket with all the best goodies in there, and every country can look at what is it that I do not have in my country that I want to get from the basket, and how do we actually adapt it so that it's fit for purpose where I'm coming from. And I am sure that we can actually get to sit around the table and agree on what are those things that we absolutely need, what are the nice to haves. The countries that have managed to advance, how have they actually gotten there? And one of the good things that we've actually seen, and I think this came as a recommendation from COM5, was that it's actually resolved. It was resolved that the AU member states must learn from one another. What are the lessons? What are the experiences that you can share among yourselves? And I can tell you, Dr. Atik, that we had that kind of exchange with one of the African countries where they visited, and it was completely different from having to read books and exchange emails, because we are able to actually walk from floor to floor. You go to a production area. How did we move from where we were to where we are? And I think this platform can really create that sort of environment where we can network with countries that we are sort of on par with, and we can learn from the countries that have done much better than we have. What we need to sort out, though, is how do we fit this into the, structurally, how do we place it so that we do not get tired from different initiatives and different structures and not being able to focus and having a duplication of roles among different structures.
Okay, so in fact, you've added an additional dimension to the ACSA requirements, which is essentially creating a cohort, creating a platform that allows for exchange of knowledge very, very specific exchange of knowledge. It's not just the standards harmonization, the toolbox that Togbe talked about, but also the community that allows you to feel that you can tap into their Africa-specific knowledge to do that. I mean, it's a great thing to add, great thing to have. I'm wondering, in your opinion, if you think the continued challenges in civil registration, since knowledge does exist, I mean, to some extent, you said the manuals have been written many years ago, we know what the processes are. Is it that the population doesn't see value in civil registration and the politicians therefore reflect that value, while identity is making progress? Civil registration is still having bigger challenges than, relatively speaking. And do we see, for example, in Namibia, the change to digital, an opportunity where civil registration can tie into the digital identity and therefore can piggyback on it? So what I'm trying to suggest, maybe it's not knowledge that we're lacking, maybe it is sort of a compelling value proposition of the civil registration process itself. So are we at that level of reflection, Tulemeki, where you can assess what is the cause of this?
Dr. Atik, I think we are actually there. For what we actually need to improve on is having a pool of champions for civil registration. How are we taking the discourse on civil registration up into the relevant structures where certain decisions have to be made? Because it's not so much, it is different when you communicate that we need to achieve legal identity for all, which is a very simple phrase to tell to someone for them to remember, but how do you actually get to do that? What do you need to have in place? What conversations are we having with the political leadership for us to be able to get that political will? We need a pool of champions. A country must have a pool of champions, not one champion, because we need to ensure continuity. You can have various laws in place, and even if you have the law in place, if the one driver or the two drivers behind that law are no longer there, then everything actually comes crumbling down. So we need to do more than that. Value proposition, yes, it's there. Does it have a driver? How many drivers do you actually have to ensure continuity? And I'm sure we can achieve that through this shared asset that we're speaking about, because we'll be able to come up with very clear, at least the basics. We can come up with that clear skeleton on how do you actually move from A to B. You can decide whether you are going to use a bus or a plane or a train. The important thing is you need to get there, and there should be resources to assist you to actually get there.
Okay. So you think we can articulate a value proposition to the general public, not just the politicians?
Yes, I'm sure we can.
Okay, let's hold on to that. Let's move on to Jinabu Kamara, and the translator will be with us on the stage. Diane, Jinabu, the same perspective. I'd like to understand Guinea's perspective on the need for a shared asset and what value does this bring and what shape do you think it should take?
Donc, Madame Jinabu, vous voulez l'interpréter?
Docteur Joseph, les perspectives pour la Guinée est d'abord la réforme du cadre juridique.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joseph. The perspectives for Guinea are first the reform of the legal frame.
Donc, nous pensons qu'il faut d'abord tenir compte du cadre juridique pour parler d'identité juridique et d'identité numérique à la fois et créer un seul portail d'identification.
We think that we need to talk about legal frame to be able to talk about legal identity and to create a single portal of identification.
Nous sommes en train d'aller dans ce sens.
We are going towards that direction at the moment.
Alors, oui. On vous entend.
Vous m'entendez? D'accord.
Oui.
Donc, je disais que pour nous, c'est d'abord revoir le cadre légal et réglementaire de l'enregistrement civil.
So for us, first is to revise the legal frame and civil registration.
Ensuite, nous avons bâti un programme qui va aller sur la durée de 5 ans.
And then we built a program that will be enrolled through 5 years.
Et ce programme va nous permettre de commencer par l'enregistrement civil, donc les faits d'état civil.
And this program will allow to start with the civil registration, so vital acts.
Et qui va permettre de donner une identité juridique à tous les Guinéens qui n'en ont pas.
And will allow to provide a legal identity to all the Guineans who don't have one yet.
Et au même moment, nous allons pouvoir leur donner une identité numérique.
And at the same time, we'll be able to provide them a digital identity.
Jenabo, mais comment l'initiative ACSA peut vous aider dans cette démarche? How does the initiative ACSA help you? I understand the ambition of Guinea, but the question that I'm asking is, how does Guinea view an initiative around common shared assets in the implementation of your program? Comment vous voyez l'initiative ACSA?
Je pense que si on doit tirer les leçons de notre workshop en Namibie,
oui.
Nous avons adhéré à l'initiative ACSA, mais nous pensons que l'initiative ACSA doit pouvoir aider les pays africains à avoir des normes en termes de cadre juridique pour qu'on, d'un commun accord, ACSA puisse nous permettre de dire pour l'enregistrement civil, voilà les normes qu'il faut appliquer. Comme nous avons aujourd'hui un manuel des Nations sur l'enregistrement civil qui a été révisé en 2022, comment l'ACSA va nous rapprocher davantage sur les normes et standards en termes d'enregistrement civil. Et pour moi, il y a 2 niveaux sur lesquels ACSA peut nous aider. Non seulement il y a le côté digital, donc numérique par rapport aux applications open source pour éviter que les pays ne soient pris en otage par les prestataires qui, par moment, ne vont pas nous permettre d'avoir accès à nos propres données, mais ACSA peut être aujourd'hui comme une interface pour les pays africains, surtout du Sud, pour nous mettre à disposition des open source qui nous permettent de gérer et d'avoir le contrôle sur l'identité parce que c'est une question de souveraineté nationale. Mais au-delà de ça, ACSA aussi peut nous permettre de renforcer les capacités des responsables que nous sommes, mais également former un corps d'experts au niveau informatique, donc de développeurs de tous nos besoins. On peut constituer un groupe aujourd'hui à travers ACSA, avoir une école régionale qui va former les gens sur pas seulement l'enregistrement, mais sur la gestion de l'identité en Afrique. Donc pour moi, l'ACSA va au-delà d'être un outil, une boîte à idées ou cela, mais l'ACSA doit pouvoir aider l'Afrique à avoir les ressources humaines capables d'accompagner la digitalisation non seulement de l'état civil, mais de l'identité, mais des services à la population dans nos pays. Pour moi, c'est un peu le rôle que ACSA doit jouer. Si on parle de plateformes, on a des plateformes de communication en Afrique qui existent via la CEA, qui nous permet aujourd'hui d'échanger, d'avoir un document avec nos collègues des autres pays, mais on doit aller au-delà de cet échange WhatsApp que nous avons.
Okay, Diane.
I'll try to convey a bit what she said. So I think if we have taken some lessons from the workshop is that we do think we would adopt ACSA initiative, but it should help to provide norms and to establish norms in terms of civil registration. Today, we have a manual, and ACSA should be able to help us to establish a revised manual from the one that has been established in 2022. So it would be to get us closer to open standards and to norms. So that would be in two different levels. First, so the digital open source to avoid being hostage from providers, and also to offer an interface to that open source to provide the countries something that would allow to control their own identity and their own identity systems.
Okay. Clearly.
And to reinforce as well, help reinforce the capacities to build the experts and developers that would be able to provide all that is needed in a technical point of view, and also to help train people and maybe build regional schools. So ACSA would be beyond just a toolbox. It would offer human resources and as well would allow to follow up with the digitalization, not only of the identity, but also with of the services offered to population, and to allow exchanges between countries that would go beyond the WeChat group.
Okay. Diane, thank you. Thank you, Janabu, thank you. I want to ask three people, and then I'll open it to the rest, but I want to get perspective from Cornelius, from Tokbe, and from Edward, representing different aspects. I would like your perspective on where do we go from here, leveraging your experience and wisdom from the development, from the government, and from the developer side. So Cornelius, where should ACSA go from here?
Where do we go from here? The first thing actually is we need to work with the champion countries, or the countries, as you said, the bootstrapping, right? We need to work with those groups actually to see how we can be able to mobilize their registrar generals to work with us. And this is, I'm not going to call it a working group, but this is actually to have a small governance structure, a small group of people who are going to work on this in an organic way. The next thing, actually, we also need this harmonization and standards that we're talking about, the clarification of the terminology. This has come up repeatedly. How do we ensure there is a clarification of terminology, right? And Rosemary has raised it, actually, a colleague from Togo has raised it. Okay. The other thing that we need to do is to make sure that we come up with a simple roadmap. I don't want to call it a big technical name, but a simple roadmap. And the final thing is looking at how it's going to link with other initiatives. One last thing, Joseph, is where do we go from here? I'm asking international colleagues of international agency to make a commitment also to support the registrar generals, right? We have three who are here from four people from different countries. If we can even start, as Rosemary said, on 3 issues, 4 countries. Let's just start with that. Back to you.
And William and Bhaskar, were the 4 elements that Cornelius talked about, were the things that were agreed to at the workshop? Was that the output of the workshop?
So Joseph, the understanding was, because before I answer your question, just give me a minute.
Okay.
In terms of data standards harmonization, like we have been discussing about this for decades.
Right.
it's not only about harmonizing data standards within CRVS. It has to be, like across health, civil registration, and national ID systems, because these three systems are organically connected. And when we talk about establishing a health, civil registration, national ID pathway, it has two advantages. You collect information once and use multiple times and move information, not people. The good thing is that we have solutions to all these things that have been discussed. Standardizing forms, like you have principles and guidebooks, you have tons of documents coming from CRVS, and we have excellent examples coming from African countries. They have managed to do it. So this is a low-hanging fruit for us, and this can be easily sorted out. But coming to the bigger picture that, in terms of standardizing your legally permissible time period, we have legally, countries had legal, legacy systems in the past. Okay, if you look at Francophone countries, immediately after the expiry of the legal window, they have to go to courts to get the permission. So that is one area, as UNSD recommends, we leave it to countries to decide what suits best in their context. And coming to your four important areas, my take would be that we should keep the entire process simple. As I said, CRVS digitization is not rocket science. We should take small but concrete steps. As we are already in 2023, we have some very, very visible milestones. So going forward, I think we should embed this initiative as part of the existing framework and structure of, African Union, by CRVS, UNLEA. But at the same time, we should also start working on the technical and implementation modalities moving forward. My second suggestion would be to set up a small advisory group of technical experts from countries supported by partners to look at all the issues that have been discussed here, and also to work on the modalities of implementation. As Cornelius said, we need to have an action-based roadmap to establish a set of digital CRVS asset for Africa. And the starting point has to be the problem statement or a set of problem statements, because what might be a problem statement for Togo might not be a problem statement for Senegal, because CRVS varies across countries and even within inside a country. Then we build the necessary asset conforming to core functional and non-functional requirements. We already have a set of those requirements that UNICEF helped to develop. And then those things should align with 10 determinants of CRVS and data standards harmonization. And the critical thing is to organize a meeting of Registrar General and get their view. And then those recommendations should be placed before the upcoming Ministers' Conference. From our side, we are very keen to provide the ad hoc secretariat support, UNICEF and UNICA. And that is the way forward, Joseph. Thanks.
Okay, Bhaskar. William, do you want to add anything before I go to Togo and then Ed for a close? And of course, Fimang, if you have anything to add to Bhaskar from the development perspective, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, one small aspect, possibly, which we have observed over the period. We can identify experts from the countries, but they cannot do the pen holding because they have other responsibilities. And that's where we have failed. That's where we got stuck, because the experts can give advisory services, or they can look at the products and make, suggestions, but there needs to be a pool doing the pen holding. And that's why I am actually, they can work from anywhere. That we agree these days is possible. But if we don't have that group, which is actually pushing the pen, then we'll be stuck after a year. We'll be still there.
Okay.
Over to you.
Okay, I understand. Okay, Fumeng, you want to add anything to your colleagues before I go to Togo?
So Joseph, maybe I would just want to add one thing to your question of, did we hear these 4 recommendations that Cornelius was talking about in the room? I want to say we heard it in the room. So I want to reconfirm that.
Exactly. That's the key, is that this is not something that you came up with this afternoon. This is something that came out in the workshop. Excellent. Togo, do you want to give us perspective on where do you think this initiative should go from here?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Atik. I can say that I'm aligned with what Bhaskar already said, but just to add on that, we noticed that in the process, there is no digitalization or digitization experts committee in the different work committees. So I think it was a recommendation from the workshop that we make sure that with the help of a secretary or a permanent secretary, this technical team can work on those set of standard functional specification and toolbox so that we move also on the technical aspect of the issue. Thank you.
Okay, that's an excellent input. Ed, where do we go from here? And maybe while at it, can you just briefly tell us, we ran a hackathon which had to do with something related to interoperability, not just interoperability of CRVS, but CRVS and ID. How does that hackathon demonstrate or fit into the objectives of such an initiative as ACSA? But please tell us where we go from here first.
Okay, where we go first. So firstly, at OpenCRVS, we're, I think the feedback which we've heard, on this call, we're motivated and able to, we want to get going. I'm hearing, start small, with a small set of champions, bootstrap something, and get moving. We're certainly up for supporting that. If, to William's point, to use the metaphor, if somebody is required to hold the pen, we're happy to hold the pen and start drafting things if that's supportive, etc. But actually, I'm quite a details-oriented person. So, start what I'm hearing. I've been sort of making notes as I've heard. Each of the country representatives here has been talking about needs and desires of ACSA, which are all slightly different. And they're actually falling within what I would call a hierarchy of the asset. At the top level of the hierarchy, there's business assets, into which you would put model laws that facilitate registration and digitize registration, for example, terminologies, efficient business processes. Then there's a second layer, which is design assets, which is more, the data standards, functional architectures, system requirements, interoperability standards, which I'll come back to. And then there's a third part, which may or may not be required by countries, would be the software assets, a set of reusable, modular components which could be reused by different countries. So I think there's a hierarchy, which of course is quite commonplace. You start with business need, then unpack it into information or application needs, and then software itself. So I think we can organize ourselves like that. In terms of the roadmap, I think it's been, many of the components of it have been mentioned. In particular, Rosemary was unpacking it. It's exactly what needs to happen in the first instance. An exercise of mapping what currently exists in terms of laws, those forms that Rosemary referred to in terms of, understanding, where the variability and where the commonalities are, business processes, etc. Then it's really important to understand, like I said, the differences and variabilities across countries based on local contexts, and compare them. And then we can get at, an understanding of what is common and reusable. And that's ultimately the value proposition of ACSA, that there is something common. I've heard back that yes, there's an understanding that is the case. I've added to my list in terms of what that might be, in terms of shared goals, data standards, interface specifications, common business processes, which have the potential, probably variability of common business processes across the continent, probably francophone, anglophone type business processes which might fit their model laws, etc. And then the common building blocks of functionality, could be built on top of that. And I think what's important to say, so I think that's rather logical, and it's been said. I'm just summarizing a little bit what the representatives have said from the countries. I think the way in which we work is like I mentioned, starting small, with champions in an agile way, but also working in the open, working in a transparent way, where all of the outputs are reviewable across the continent, etc., such that it is consistent and full feedback and peer-to-peer learning on those assets as they take shape. Apologies, quite a long answer. Then you asked me about the hackathon at ID4Africa, and how that's relevant. So, well, thanks firstly for those who came by. ID4Africa dropped past our stand where we ran an interoperability hackathon. So that was to get at this idea. We talk a lot on such sessions about interoperability, but actually few countries are actually getting the true value of that interoperability. So what we wanted to do in just a few short weeks, we took OpenCRVS as a open source civil registration system, and we invited different participants to come and interoperate with OpenCRVS to show value add use cases. And we had open source digital public goods participate. We had proprietary vendors participate right across the board. We had interoperability with health, using the FHIR data standard, showing notifications of birth coming from the health system into OpenCRVS to kick off the registration process. In just a few short weeks, these were possible because we exposed an open set of standards which participants were able to use. So we showed health interoperability, we showed ID interoperability, both with IN Group. So IN Group built, in particular, a piece of innovation where they were able to take the certificate, which is obviously the product of the civil registration process, and put it in a digital wallet. So they're able to use our API to be able to do that. And likewise, we interoperated with the modular open source identity platform in a similar way to create a unique identifier from birth, and showing the tight coupling between civil registration and ID, which to me was a key feature of ID4Africa, that this connection between civil registration and ID was really emphasized, and the value was really better understood, I think, this year. And then finally, because we did a lot in the hackathon, and the final piece of interoperability which we proved was interoperability with social protection systems. So we had OpenSPP, a social protection system, and the Digital Convergence Initiative use civil registration data related to the birth of a child and the death of a husband to actually assign eligibility criteria for a social protection program, all through using the open standards and interoperability with OpenCRVS.
In fact, for me, if I had to say, how do we leverage the way forward, and what is the change that is going to make it now possible to do things that we could not do before, or we failed in doing before, I think it's the word interoperability. If we make civil registration interoperable with health, if we make it interoperable with ID, if we make it interoperable with social protection, now we're creating an ecosystem that becomes a user of civil registration, relies on civil registration. And the whole idea is that civil registration cannot be a silo. It has to become open. It has to become accessible to all these other highly dependent, even electoral systems, even refugee systems. All of those have to be enabled. And I think the vision could be that civil registration is not an end in itself, even though legally it's supposed to convey to somebody their legal rights. The very fact that we can link it through an interoperable and open standards-based mechanism. This is why I thought the hackathon was really brilliant, because it showed at the heart of all these systems that you talked about, Ed, it was civil registration. The civil registration in a digital context, you cannot attribute to somebody digital rights all the way without having access to civil registration. Why? Because somebody may not be able to claim inheritance in the digital context, may not be able to vote in a digital context, may not be able to claim the residence in the digital context. So yes, you can create an economic identity, we call it digital identity, but unless you link it to the origin of this person, which is validated by the civil register, you still have this attestation limited, and the privileges that we have are limited. So I think, from my perspective, let the next year, all the way to the ID4Africa 2024, be the year of interoperability, and let's try to build on standards for interoperability to strengthen civil registration and change the facts on the ground. Clearly, this is the sentiment that many of you have shared with me, and I echo it, and I agree with you. But it is definitely not a simple task, but it's a hopeful task, because we see a potential shift, we see a potential change, and it's all built on the idea that open civil registration enabling other things. So with that, I will thank.
Joseph, can I get 20 seconds?
Yes.
I have been working in this area for last 15 years. You know, like I've worked in Asia, South Asia, I've worked in Africa, and I can tell you based on my experience, demand creation has never been a problem, provided we sort out the supply side challenges. And when I say supply side challenges, registration and certifications should be done in one step. Okay. And countries, you know, like just look at your processes, you know, like in Uganda, they need maybe like 3 digits. So the message is, if you simplify the processes, you will get to it. Thanks.
Excellent. So I want to thank you all. I'll emphasize this is not the end of our discussion on ACSA. We floated a pilot, and it seems that countries have embraced it, but there's a lot more work ahead. I hope we will hear from the working group and hear from the development partners about their engagement in this area. We commit to make our platform, this community platform, available to your needs, whether the Livecast or the AGM next year, and that we can continue on this journey together. It's unacceptable that we are entering into the period of 7 years away from 2030, and we still do not have 100% civil registration in Africa. So we are committed to doing that, and hopefully working together, we can get there. So I thank you for that. And with this closes the augmented general meeting for ID4Africa 2023. All the material is available online now as digital public goods. So please be free to share and like and watch and rewatch this material. And in the meantime, please reach out to me with any issues, ideas, and suggestions. We would love to hear from you about what your needs are and how we could help address them. With that, I close this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, all the speakers, all the participants. Thank you.
Thank you so much.